In the soft candlelight of a quiet evening, let us travel back across nearly 2,500 years to the ancient city of Athens, where an old philosopher named Plato sat down to write of a wonder that he claimed had once existed at the very dawn of the world and had vanished beneath the waves in a single terrible day and night. The story he told was of a great island empire called Atlantis, a civilization of extraordinary power and splendour that had risen far out in the Western Ocean, beyond the edge of the known world, and that had been swallowed by the sea in a catastrophe so complete that scarcely a memory of it survived. From these few pages, written by one man in one city in the 4th century before the Common Era, has grown one of the most enduring and haunting legends in all of human history, a tale that has captivated the imagination of countless generations and that endures, undimmed, to this very night. Across the span of more than 23 centuries, the legend of Atlantis would inspire countless expeditions across uncharted waters, would fill the pages of more than 2,000 scholarly treatises and imaginative works, would become woven into the founding mythologies of at least a dozen different civilizations and nations, would be sought in locations ranging from the depths of the Atlantic Ocean to the frozen reaches of Antarctica to the sun-baked sands of the Sahara Desert, and would ultimately establish itself as perhaps the single most influential lost civilization narrative in the entire history of human storytelling. The tale that Plato committed to papyrus in approximately 360 before the Common Era would outlive his own civilization, would survive the fall of Rome, would persist through the long centuries of the medieval period, would experience a dramatic revival during the age of exploration and colonization, and would in our own era generate an entire industry of books, films, documentaries, and speculative investigations that shows no signs of diminishing. The island that may never have existed has proven more enduring than countless islands that certainly did exist, more memorable than empires whose ruins still stand, more vivid in the human imagination than civilizations whose monuments we can still visit and whose inscriptions we can still read. But on that day in Athens, when the elderly philosopher first set down his account of the sunken island empire, none of this vast future legacy could have been predicted or imagined. Plato was then in his 70s, a man who had lived through war and political upheaval, who had travelled widely across the Greek world and beyond, who had founded his famous academy and trained generations of students in philosophy, and who had written dialogue after dialogue exploring the deepest questions of human existence. The Atlantis story appears in 2 of his late works, dialogues called the Timaeus and the Critias, and these remain to this day the only primary sources for the original legend, the bedrock upon which all subsequent Atlantis lore has been constructed. To understand the story of Atlantis, we must first understand the circumstances under which it was written, the philosophical purposes it was meant to serve, and the particular genius of the man who created it, whether from ancient tradition or from the depths of his own remarkable imagination. The Athens in which Plato lived and wrote was a city that had passed through its greatest age and entered into a period of decline and uncertainty. The golden age of Athenian democracy, of Pericles and the Parthenon, of Sophocles and Euripides, had given way to the disasters of the Peloponnesian War, to plague and defeat, and the humiliation of submission to Sparta. Plato himself had witnessed the trial and execution of his beloved teacher Socrates in 399, before the Common Era, condemned to drink hemlock by the very democratic assembly that was supposed to embody Athenian virtue and wisdom. This experience had marked Plato deeply, had convinced him that the ordinary mass of citizens could not be trusted to recognize true virtue or to govern wisely, and had set him on a lifelong quest to understand what justice truly was, what constituted the ideal society, and how human beings might be brought to live in accordance with the highest good. All of Plato's philosophical works, including the dialogues in which Atlantis appears, must be understood in the context of this quest, this burning desire to discover and to teach the principles of righteous governance and virtuous living. The dialogue called the Timaeus, in which the story of Atlantis first appears, is ostensibly concerned with the creation of the universe and the nature of the physical world. It features 4 speakers, Socrates, Timaeus, Critias, and Hermocrates, gathered in Athens for a philosophical conversation that will span cosmology, natural science, and political philosophy. At the opening of the dialogue, Socrates reminds his companions of a discussion they had the previous day, in which he had outlined the structure of an ideal state, and he asks them now to show him this ideal state in action, as it were, to describe the citizens of such a state engaged in war and in all the activities befitting their noble characters. It is in response to this request that Critias, an elderly Athenian aristocrat, offers to tell a story that he insists is absolutely true, that concerns the very same ideal Athens that Socrates had described, but in its actual historical form engaged in the greatest deed it ever performed. And this deed, Critias explains, was the defeat of the mighty empire of Atlantis. The story, Critias tells his companions, had come down to him through his family, passed from generation to generation since the time of Solon, the famous Athenian lawgiver who had lived approximately 200 years before Plato's own time. Solon was remembered as one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece, a man of profound wisdom who had reformed the laws of Athens and who had travelled widely in his later years, seeking knowledge wherever it could be found. According to the account that Critias provides, Solon had journeyed to Egypt in his old age, to the ancient city of Sais in the delta of the Nile, and there he had conversed with the priests of the great temple of the goddess Neith, whom the Greeks identified with their own Athena. These priests were the keepers of records stretching back thousands of years, records inscribed on temple columns and preserved in sacred archives, and they possessed knowledge of events that had long been forgotten by the younger civilizations of the Greek world. One of these aged priests, conversing with Solon, had gently rebuked the Greek visitor for the limitations of his historical knowledge. "You Greeks," the priest had said, "are all children in your souls, for you possess no ancient tradition, no learning hoary with age." The reason for this, the priest explained, was that the earth is periodically devastated by great catastrophes, sometimes by fire when the heavens rain destruction, sometimes by flood when the waters rise and sweep away everything in their path. Each time such a catastrophe occurs, the priest continued, the civilizations of mankind are destroyed, and the survivors, reduced to illiteracy and barbarism, must begin again from nothing, with no memory of what came before. In Greece, which is particularly susceptible to such disasters, the cycle of destruction and renewal has occurred again and again, erasing all memory of the distant past. But Egypt, protected by the Nile and by the particular conditions of its climate and geography, has preserved its records through all the ages, and the priests of the temple possess knowledge of events that no Greek could possibly remember. And then the priest had told Solon of a great deed that the Athenians themselves had once performed, in an age so impossibly remote that 9,000 years had passed since the events in question. This would place the Atlantis story, from our perspective today, approximately 11,600 years in the past, in an era when, according to modern archaeology, human civilization as we understand it had not yet emerged, when the last ice age was only just coming to an end, and the great glaciers of the north were beginning their long retreat. In that distant age, the priest told Solon, there had existed a mighty power that had risen in the Western Ocean, on an island of enormous size that lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the narrow strait that we know today as the Strait of Gibraltar. This strait, only some 8 miles wide at its narrowest point, was the gateway between the familiar waters of the Mediterranean and the vast mysterious Atlantic beyond, and in ancient times it was regarded as the very edge of the known world, the boundary beyond which lay unknown lands and unknown terrors. The island of Atlantis, according to the Egyptian priest's account, had been larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, a landmass of almost continental proportions that dominated the Western Ocean. From this great island, travellers could pass to other islands beyond, and from those islands to the opposite continent that surrounded the true ocean on its farther shore. Here, in this brief aside, the Atlantis story contains what some have interpreted as a remarkably prescient description of the Americas, a great continent on the far side of the Atlantic Ocean, unknown to the Greeks of Plato's time but accurately positioned in the geography of the legend. Whether this represents genuine ancient knowledge, fortunate coincidence, or simply the logical extrapolation that if one sailed far enough west one would eventually reach land, has been debated endlessly and remains one of the many intriguing elements of the Atlantis tradition. On this great island of Atlantis, the priest continued, there had arisen a confederation of kings possessing great and marvellous power. These kings ruled not only the island itself, but many other islands and parts of the continent as well, and their dominion had extended even within the Pillars of Heracles, encompassing Libya as far as Egypt and Europe, as far as Tyrrhenia, the region of central Italy. This was an empire of truly vast extent, stretching from the depths of the Atlantic to the shores of the eastern Mediterranean, a power such as the world had never seen before or since. And in their pride and their ambition, the kings of Atlantis had determined to enslave all the peoples who lived within the pillars, to add Egypt and Greece and all the other free nations to their already enormous domain, to become masters of the entire known world. Against this overwhelming power, one city alone had stood firm and defiant. The ancient Athens of 9,000 years ago, according to the priest's account, had been a very different city from the Athens of Solon's time or of Plato's time, a city governed according to the principles of virtue and wisdom, organised in the manner of an ideal state, with its citizens divided into appropriate classes and trained in the arts both of war and of peace. This ancient Athens had rallied the free peoples of Greece and had led the resistance against the Atlantean invaders. When her allies fell away and abandoned the cause, when Athens stood alone against the massed might of the island empire, the ancient Athenians had not wavered. Through their courage, their discipline, and their superior virtue, they had defeated the invaders, had freed all the peoples who had been enslaved, and had preserved liberty for all who dwelt within the pillars of Heracles. It was, in the priest's telling, the greatest and most glorious deed in the history of the Greek people, a deed so ancient that all memory of it had been erased by subsequent catastrophes, preserved only in the unbroken records of the Egyptian temples. And then, after this great victory had come the catastrophe. In a single, terrible day and night, violent earthquakes and floods had convulsed the earth. The Athenian army, those heroic warriors who had saved the Greek world, had been swallowed up by the earth, disappearing into great chasms that opened beneath their feet. And the island of Atlantis, in the same dreadful convulsion, had sunk entirely beneath the sea and vanished from the face of the earth. In the space of 24 hours, the mightiest empire the world had ever known had ceased to exist, leaving behind only a vast expanse of impassable mud and shallows where once the great island had stood, rendering that portion of the Atlantic Ocean unnavigable for ages afterward. Thus had Atlantis perished, and thus had the memory of Atlantis perished with it, forgotten by all except the priests of Egypt, who had preserved the record through all the intervening millennia. This, in essence, is the story that Critias tells in the Timaeus, a brief summary of the legend that would later be expanded in great detail in the subsequent dialogue, the Critias, which is devoted entirely to the description of ancient Athens and ancient Atlantis. The Timaeus summary is important because it establishes the framework within which the Atlantis story is to be understood, the moral contrast between virtuous Athens and corrupt Atlantis, the idea of divine punishment for imperial overreach, and the concept of periodic catastrophes that erase human memory and force civilizations to begin anew. These themes would be developed at much greater length in the Critias, but they are already present in embryo in the briefer account, and they reveal something fundamental about the purpose that the Atlantis story was meant to serve in Plato's philosophical project. The dialogue Critias picks up where the Timaeus left off, and in this work Plato provides the detailed description of Atlantis that has captivated readers ever since. The account begins with the division of the earth among the gods in the earliest age of the world, when each deity received a portion of the globe to rule and to populate with worshippers. The goddess Athena received the land of Attica, where Athens would rise, and she and Hephaestus, the god of craftsmen, together populated it, with noble autochthonous people, born from the very soil of Greece, and established among them the institutions of the ideal state. The god Poseidon received the island of Atlantis, far out in the western ocean, and he too set about populating and shaping his domain according to his divine will. On the island of Atlantis, in those earliest days, there lived a mortal man named Evenor and his wife Leucippe, and they had a daughter of surpassing beauty whose name was Cleito. When her parents died, Poseidon, the great god of the sea, who had beheld Cleito and fallen in love with her, took her for his own. To protect his beloved and to ensure that no mortal could approach her dwelling place, the god reshaped the very landscape of the island around the low hill where Cleito lived. He carved out alternate rings of sea and land, 2 rings of land and 3 of water, encircling the central hill with these concentric bands as precisely as if he had turned them on a lathe. The rings were perfectly circular, perfectly measured, the water channels deep enough to accommodate the largest ships, the land rings broad enough to support buildings and vegetation, and all the activities of human life. At the centre of these rings, isolated and protected stood the hill where Clito dwelt, and there Poseidon established his palace and his sanctuary. Poseidon and Clito together produced 10 sons, 5 pairs of twins, and to these sons the god gave dominion over the island and over the surrounding regions. The eldest of the first pair of twins was named Atlas, and he was given authority over all his brothers and made the first king of the whole island. It was from this first king that the island took its name, Atlantis, the island of Atlas, and the great ocean that surrounded it took his name as well, the Atlantic, a name that survives to this day as the designation for the body of water that separates Europe and Africa from the Americas. The twin brother of Atlas was named Eumelus in Greek, or Gudaeus in the native tongue, and he received the extremity of the island toward the Pillars of Heracles, the region that faces the country now called Gadara, which we know today as Cadiz in Spain. The other 8 brothers received other portions of the island and of the surrounding territories, and from them descended long lines of kings who ruled over their allotted regions for many generations. Under the rule of these 10 royal houses descended from the divine blood of Poseidon himself, the island of Atlantis grew into a civilization of unparalleled wealth and magnificence. Plato's description of the island's natural resources reads like an inventory of earthly paradise. The island produced in abundance everything that nature could provide, both what grows from the earth and what lives upon it. There were 2 harvests each year, the land being watered by the rains of heaven in winter, and by irrigation from its many rivers and springs in summer. The mountains were tall and beautiful, their slopes covered with villages and farms and pastures, and their forests provided timber in wonderful quantity. The plains were broad and fertile, the most beautiful and most productive in all the world. The island teemed with animals of every kind, both domesticated and wild, and even, Plato writes, great herds of elephants, for the land was so abundant that it could support even the largest and most voracious of creatures. The earth beneath the surface was equally rich, yielding up in many parts of the island a metal called orichalcum, which in that age was accounted more precious than any substance except gold alone. This mysterious metal, which gleamed with a reddish fire-like hue, has been the subject of endless speculation, as no substance known to modern metallurgy precisely matches Plato's description. Some have suggested it was a natural alloy of copper and gold, others that it was amber or some other substance that the Greeks classified with metals, still others that it was purely imaginary, another element in Plato's carefully constructed fantasy. Whatever orichalcum may have been, the island also produced gold and silver and copper and tin and iron in abundance, so that the kings of Atlantis wanted for nothing that the earth could provide. Upon this foundation of natural wealth, the kings of Atlantis constructed a city and a civilization of breathtaking grandeur. At the centre of everything, on the original hill where Clito had dwelt and where Poseidon had established his sanctuary, they built the citadel and the holiest temples of the kingdom. They bridged the rings of water with stone bridges broad enough to allow the passage of vehicles and ships, and they tunnelled through the rings of land and roofed the passages over, creating covered channels through which triremes could sail from one ring to the next. They dug a great canal from the outermost ring of water to the open sea, wide enough and deep enough to accommodate the largest ships of the age so that vessels could sail directly from the ocean into the very heart of the city. The rings of land they covered with buildings, with docks and warehouses, with gardens and groves and gymnasiums, with elaborate fountains and bathing establishments fed by hot and cold springs. The harbours were crowded with ships and merchants from every corner of the known world, and the constant bustle of commerce filled the air with noise and activity day and night. The walls that enclosed the rings of land were faced with metals in ascending order of preciousness as one approached the centre. The outermost wall was covered with bronze, gleaming in the sun with a warm golden light. The next wall was covered with tin, shining with a silvery brilliance, and the innermost wall, surrounding the citadel itself, was covered with orichalcum, flashing with that mysterious red fire that outshone all metals save gold alone. Within the citadel stood the sacred places that were the heart of the kingdom, including the temple of Poseidon and Clito that marked the very origin point of the royal race. This spot was enclosed by a wall of gold and forbidden to all, a holy of holies at the centre of the island empire. Nearby stood the great temple of Poseidon himself, a structure of extraordinary and almost barbaric magnificence. The exterior was covered entirely with silver, except for the pinnacles which were covered with gold. The interior was even more splendid. The roof of ivory adorned everywhere with gold and silver and orichalcum, the walls and pillars and floors all covered with orichalcum that gleamed like fire in the torchlight. Within this temple stood a colossal statue of the god himself, Poseidon standing in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses, so enormous that his head touched the very roof of the temple above. Around him stood 100 Nereids riding upon dolphins, and around the exterior of the temple stood golden statues of all the kings and queens who had descended from the 10 original princes, along with many other offerings of great size and value given by the kings and by the private citizens of the realm. The temple was a monument not only to the god but to the divine lineage of the ruling house, a constant reminder that the kings of Atlantis were not ordinary mortals, but the descendants of Poseidon himself, bearing within them a portion of divine nature that set them apart from and above all other peoples of the earth. Beyond the rings of the central city stretched the great plain of Atlantis, rectangular in shape and surrounded by mountains on all sides except toward the sea. This plain, Plato tells us, was 3,000 stadia in length and 2,000 stadia in width at its centre, measurements that would make it approximately 340 by 230 miles, an area roughly the size of Ireland. The plain was naturally level and beautiful, surrounded by mountains that were celebrated throughout the world for their number, size, and beauty. In these mountains were many villages and a wealthy population, and rivers and lakes that supplied the plain with water and carried down timber from the heights. Around the entire perimeter of the plain, the Atlanteans had dug a great ditch or canal, 100 feet deep and 1 stade in width, with a total length of some 10,000 stadia, creating a rectangular moat that enclosed the entire cultivated area. The system of irrigation that the Atlanteans had constructed on this plain was one of the marvels of their civilization. Straight canals 100 feet wide were cut across the plain at regular intervals, running from the mountain streams to the great peripheral ditch and back again. Along these canals, boats transported the timber that was cut in the mountains, and bridges allowed traffic to pass from one section of the plain to another. 2 crops were raised each year, the winter crop watered by rain, the summer crop watered by the irrigation system, and the yield of the plain was sufficient to support the enormous population and military establishment of the island empire. The military forces that the kings of Atlantis could marshal from this fertile plain were truly staggering in their numbers. Each allotment of the plain was required to provide a fixed quota of men and equipment in time of war. The numbers that Plato provides, if taken literally, would produce an army of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of chariots, and a navy of 1,200 warships, a military establishment that would dwarf the forces of any nation known to the ancient Greeks. These forces were under the command of the 10 kings, who ruled their own territories independently, but who were bound together by the laws and customs established by Poseidon at the founding of the kingdom. The pillar that stood in the temple of Poseidon was inscribed with the laws of the kingdom, and every 5th or 6th year the 10 kings assembled at the temple to judge matters of common concern, to offer sacrifice, and to renew their oaths of loyalty to each other and to the laws of their divine ancestor. The ceremony of this assembly was one of the most striking passages in Plato's account. When the 10 kings had gathered at the temple, they were left alone with the sacred bulls that roamed freely in the precinct of Poseidon. Armed only with staves and nooses, forbidden to use any weapon of iron, the kings hunted one of the bulls and captured it, then led it to the sacred pillar and slaughtered it at the summit, letting the blood flow down over the inscribed laws. The bull was then burned according to the customary rites, and the kings, mixing wine with the clotted blood in a bowl, each cast in a clot of the blood and swore to give judgment, and to be judged according to the laws upon the pillar. After drinking from the bowl and dedicating the cups in the temple, they dined together and continued their deliberations into the night, putting on robes of most beautiful azure when darkness came, and sitting in judgment over any accusations that had been brought against any of them. For many generations, Plato tells us, as long as the divine nature retained its power within them, the kings of Atlantis ruled wisely and virtuously. They were obedient to the laws, well disposed toward their kinsmen who shared their divine blood, and gentle in their dealings with all. They regarded their vast wealth and their magnificent possessions as trifling things, carrying the burden of their gold and their other goods lightly, not staggering under their weight like drunken men. They understood that all these material advantages would increase through friendship and the practice of virtue, but would be corrupted and lost if they were pursued too eagerly for their own sake. With such thoughts and with the retention of their divine nature, they prospered mightily, and their wealth and their power only increased with the passing generations. But as the ages passed, the divine portion within them began to weaken, diluted again and again by admixture with the mortal nature that came from their human mothers and wives. Gradually the human element gained the upper hand, and the kings of Atlantis began to behave in ways unbefitting their divine ancestry. They became unable to bear their great prosperity, and to those who had eyes to see, they now appeared base and ugly, having lost the fairest of their precious gifts. But to those who could not perceive the true source of happiness and virtue, they seemed more glorious and blessed than ever, precisely at the moment when they were most filled with unrighteous greed and pride. They became aggressive and ambitious, seeking to extend their power over all the peoples of the earth, and it was in this corrupted state that they launched their great war of conquest against the peoples within the Pillars of Heracles, including the Egyptians and the Greeks. At this point in the narrative, with the stage set for the climactic confrontation between the corrupted Atlantis and the virtuous Athens, Plato introduces the divine judgment that would bring the story to its catastrophic conclusion. Zeus, the king of the gods and the supreme arbiter of justice among both gods and men, perceived the corruption of the once noble race of Atlantis and determined to punish them, hoping that chastisement might bring them back to wisdom. He gathered all the gods together in their most august dwelling place, which stands at the centre of the universe and looks down upon all things that partake of creation, and when he had assembled them, he spoke. And here, at this most dramatic and tantalizing moment, the dialogue breaks off, ending abruptly in the middle of a sentence. The speech of Zeus was never recorded. The exact nature of the divine punishment was never described. The Crisius, like Atlantis itself, vanishes incomplete, leaving readers through all the succeeding ages to wonder what the ending might have been. The reasons for this incompleteness have been debated for more than 2 millennia. Some have suggested that Plato died before he could finish the work, though this seems unlikely given that he lived for another dozen years after the probable date of composition. Others have proposed that the manuscript was somehow damaged, or that Plato simply lost interest in the project and turned to other things. Still, others have argued that the incompleteness was deliberate, that Plato intended to leave the story unfinished as a kind of artistic or philosophical statement, inviting readers to complete the narrative in their own imaginations. Whatever the reason, the effect has been to leave the Atlantis legend forever suspended at the moment of its catastrophe, the assembled gods about to pronounce their judgment, the proud empire about to face its doom, the waters about to close over the glittering towers and temples, but never quite arriving at that final extinction. We know from the earlier account in the Timaeus how the story ended, even if the details were never filled in. The Great War was fought, and the ancient Athenians, through their virtue and their courage, defeated the invaders from Atlantis and freed all the peoples who had been enslaved. And then came the earthquakes and the floods, and in a single day and night of terrible convulsion, both the Athenian army and the entire island of Atlantis were destroyed and swallowed up. The warriors of Athens disappeared into the earth, and the great island sank beneath the waves of the Atlantic, leaving behind only a shoal of impassable mud that rendered that region of the ocean unnavigable for ages afterward. The mightiest empire the world had ever known had vanished utterly, as if it had never been, and only in the ancient records of Egypt was any memory of it preserved. This is the tale that Plato told, the foundation upon which all subsequent Atlantis lore has been built. It is a remarkable narrative, rich in detail and vivid in its imagery, presenting a civilization of almost inconceivable wealth and power, destroyed in a catastrophe of biblical proportions. And from the moment the story was first told, the question has been asked that continues to be asked today, after more than 2,000 years of speculation and investigation. Did Plato intend this story to be understood as literal history, an account of events that actually occurred in the distant past, preserved in Egyptian records and committed to writing by the Greek philosopher? Or was it something else entirely, a philosophical fable, a moral allegory, a carefully constructed myth, designed to illustrate truths about human nature and the fate of civilizations that transcend any particular historical circumstance? The answer to this question matters enormously for how we understand the Atlantis legend, and for how we evaluate the countless attempts that have been made to find the lost island, or to identify it with some known historical civilization or geographic location. If Plato was recording genuine tradition, however garbled or embellished, then the search for Atlantis is a legitimate historical and archaeological inquiry, and the legend may contain clues to real events in the distant past. If, on the other hand, Plato invented the story entirely, constructing it from his own imagination to serve his philosophical purposes, then the search for Atlantis is chasing a phantom, looking for a place that never existed anywhere except in the pages of two unfinished Greek dialogues. The evidence, considered carefully, suggests strongly that the second interpretation is closer to the truth, that Atlantis was Plato's creation rather than his inheritance. Several factors point in this direction. First, there is the complete absence of any reference to Atlantis in any ancient text prior to Plato's dialogues. If the story had been a widespread tradition, preserved not only in Egypt but passed down through Greek families like that of Critias, we would expect to find some trace of it elsewhere in Greek literature. But we find nothing. Not a single reference to Atlantis appears in Homer, in Hesiod, in Herodotus, in any of the lyric poets or tragedians, in any source whatsoever before Plato. The entire legend emerges fully formed from his dialogues and from nowhere else. Second, there is the remarkable correspondence between the structure and values of Atlantis and the philosophical concerns that occupied Plato throughout his career. The contrast between virtuous Athens and corrupt Atlantis mirrors exactly the contrast between the ideal state and its degenerate forms that Plato developed at length in his Republic. The description of how the divine nature in the Atlantean kings was gradually diluted by mixture with mortal nature, leading to their corruption and downfall, echoes Plato's theory of the decline of political systems from aristocracy through timocracy, oligarchy and democracy to tyranny. The moral of the Atlantis story, that wealth and power corrupt when they are pursued for their own sake rather than subordinated to virtue, is the central lesson of Plato's entire political philosophy. In every particular, the legend seems designed to illustrate Platonic principles rather than to record historical events. Third, there is the literary technique that Plato employs in presenting the story. The elaborate chain of transmission, from Egyptian priest to Solon to Critias the Elder to Critias the Younger, serves to distance the narrative from any possible verification while simultaneously lending it the authority of ancient tradition. The repeated insistence by the characters in the dialogue that the story is true, that it is not a fiction but genuine history, is precisely the kind of technique that a skilled storyteller uses when creating a fictional narrative that he wishes to present with the weight of fact. Modern readers may recognize this technique from countless works of fiction that employ the device of the discovered manuscript or the traveller's tale to create an illusion of authenticity for invented narratives. Fourth, there are the many details of the Atlantis story that seem impossible to reconcile with any realistic historical reconstruction. The date of 9,000 years before Solon places the events in a period when, according to everything we know about human development, civilized society of any kind had not yet emerged. The dimensions of the island and its plain, if taken literally, would require a landmass of continental proportions in a location where no such landmass exists or could have existed in any relevant geological time frame. The military forces described would be impossible for any pre-modern society to organize or sustain. These impossible elements suggest that Plato was not attempting to record history, but was constructing a myth, using specific numbers and measurements to create an impression of precision and reality for a narrative that was essentially imaginative. And yet, despite all these considerations, the legend of Atlantis has never been dismissed or forgotten. There is something in the story that speaks to a place deep in the human imagination, something that resists the scholarly conclusion that it was all invented. The image of a great civilization, glittering with gold and orichalcum, powerful beyond measure, and then suddenly destroyed, swallowed by the sea in a single day and night of catastrophe, is an image of haunting and enduring power. It touches our awareness of the fragility of all human achievement, our sense that even the mightiest works of our hands are temporary and vulnerable, that civilizations rise and flourish and then fall and are forgotten, that pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. The search for Atlantis, which began almost as soon as Plato's dialogues were written and which continues to this day, has taken seekers to every corner of the globe. Aristotle, Plato's own student, is reported to have said that the man who dreamed up Atlantis also made it disappear, suggesting skepticism about the literal truth of the story, even among those closest to its author. But others were not so skeptical, and the ancient world produced numerous attempts to locate the sunken island or to explain its disappearance. Some identified Atlantis with real islands or regions that had experienced historical catastrophes. Some sought it in the western Mediterranean, in Spain or North Africa. Some placed it in the Atlantic itself, imagining a great continent that had once existed between Europe and the unknown lands to the west. In the centuries that followed, the legend of Atlantis waxed and waned with the intellectual currents of each age. During the medieval period in Europe, the story was largely forgotten, overshadowed by Christian cosmology and by concerns far removed from ancient Greek philosophy. But with the Renaissance and the rediscovery of classical texts, Atlantis returned to the European imagination, and the age of exploration gave the legend new life and new significance. The discovery of the Americas in 1492, revealing that there was indeed a great continent across the Atlantic Ocean, seemed to many to confirm some part of Plato's account, and to suggest that the lost island might really have existed somewhere in the waters between. Explorers, colonizers, and speculators of all kinds began to incorporate Atlantis into their understanding of the New World, suggesting that the civilizations of the Americas might be descended from survivors of the sunken island, that the native peoples might preserve traditions of their Atlantean ancestors, that somewhere in the unexplored regions of the Atlantic some trace of the lost empire might still be found. The 19th century saw the Atlantis legend reach new heights of popularity and elaboration. Ignatius Donnelly, an American politician and amateur scholar, published in 1882 a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, which became an enormous bestseller and established many of the ideas about Atlantis that persist in popular culture to this day. Donnelly argued that Atlantis had been a real place, the original homeland of all human civilization, from which all the great achievements of the ancient world had derived. He proposed that the gods and heroes of ancient mythology were in fact the kings and warriors of Atlantis, dimly remembered and transformed into divine figures by their descendants. He suggested that the similarities between the civilizations on opposite sides of the Atlantic, between Egypt and Mexico, between the Mediterranean world and the Americas, could be explained by their common origin in the Atlantean mother culture. Though most of Donnelly's specific claims have been discredited by subsequent research, his book established a template for Atlantis speculation that continues to influence popular treatments of the subject. The 20th and 21st centuries have seen the search for Atlantis continue along multiple tracks. Serious archaeologists and historians have generally dismissed the idea of a literal Atlantis, while acknowledging that Plato's story may contain echoes of real events, perhaps the volcanic destruction of Minoan Thera in the Aegean Sea, perhaps folk memories of sea level rises at the end of the last ice age, perhaps nothing more than the general human experience of civilizations that flourish and then fall. Meanwhile, a vast popular literature has continued to search for the lost island in every imaginable location, from the depths of the Atlantic to the frozen reaches of Antarctica, from the highlands of Bolivia to the floor of the Mediterranean, from the coast of Cuba to the shores of Ireland. The persistence of the Atlantis legend across so many centuries and in so many forms speaks to something fundamental in the human relationship with the past, a deep and abiding fascination with the possibility that the world might once have held wonders that have since been lost, that beneath the surface of what we know there might lie secrets waiting to be rediscovered. And this fascination has expressed itself not only in the serious inquiries of scholars and explorers, but also in the realm of the imagination, where Atlantis has served as a canvas upon which successive generations have projected their dreams, their fears, their hopes for what civilization might achieve and their anxieties about what it might lose. The literary and artistic tradition surrounding Atlantis stretches back to antiquity itself, but it flowered most fully in the modern era, when writers and artists discovered in the legend a rich vein of imaginative possibility. Francis Bacon, the great English philosopher of the 16th and 17th centuries, wrote a utopian fiction called The New Atlantis, published after his death in 1627, in which he imagined an ideal society governed by scientific principles and dedicated to the advancement of human knowledge. Bacon's Atlantis was not the sunken island of Plato, but a new creation, a vision of what human civilization might become if guided by reason and inquiry, and his work helped to establish Atlantis as a symbol, not only of what had been lost, but of what might yet be achieved. In the centuries that followed, Atlantis appeared in countless works of fiction, from adventure novels to philosophical romances to the emerging genre of science fiction, each author finding in the legend materials suited to their own purposes and preoccupations. Jules Verne, the French master of scientific romance, brought his characters face to face with the ruins of Atlantis in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, published in 1870, when Captain Nemo pilots his submarine through the drowned streets of the Lost City, walking among the temples and palaces that lie silent and still beneath the Atlantic waves. This image of underwater exploration, of divers descending into the green twilight to discover the preserved remnants of a vanished civilization, became one of the most potent and recurring motifs in the Atlantis tradition, capturing the imagination of readers who longed to believe that somewhere beneath the ocean the great city still slumbered, waiting to be found. The development of actual underwater exploration technology in the 20th century, from diving bells to submersibles to modern scuba equipment, only intensified this fascination as it became possible for the first time in human history to actually descend to the depths and see what lay beneath the waves. The spiritualist and esoteric movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries found in Atlantis a particularly fertile ground for speculation. Helena Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, incorporated Atlantis into her elaborate cosmological system, describing it as one of several root races through which humanity had passed in its spiritual evolution. In Blavatsky's account, the Atlanteans had been a highly advanced race possessed of psychic and spiritual powers that modern humanity had lost, and their destruction had been brought about by their misuse of these powers, a theme that echoed Plato's own account of moral corruption leading to divine punishment. Other esoteric writers elaborated upon these ideas, describing Atlantean technology that drew upon mysterious energies, Atlantean priests who communicated with higher dimensions, Atlantean sciences that combined what we would call physical and spiritual knowledge into a unified understanding of the cosmos. Edgar Cayce, the American psychic known as the Sleeping Prophet, claimed to have received visions of Atlantis during his trance states, describing a civilization that had harnessed a powerful crystal technology for energy and healing, and predicting that evidence of this civilization would be discovered in the Caribbean region, particularly near the island of Bimini in the Bahamas. These esoteric interpretations of Atlantis have remained influential in certain circles to the present day, forming part of a broader alternative history movement that questions mainstream scholarly accounts of human prehistory and proposes the existence of advanced civilizations long before those recognized by conventional archaeology. Proponents of these views point to various ancient monuments and artifacts that they believe cannot be explained by the technological capabilities attributed to their builders, suggesting that some lost civilization, perhaps Atlantis itself, must have possessed advanced knowledge that has since been forgotten. The pyramids of Egypt, the megalithic structures of South America, the underwater formations discovered off the coast of Japan, and numerous other enigmatic remains have all been incorporated into this alternative narrative, woven together into a vision of a prehistoric world far more sophisticated and interconnected than orthodox scholarship allows. The scientific and archaeological communities have responded to these claims with considerable skepticism, pointing out the many errors of fact and reasoning that typically characterize alternative history arguments, the failure to consider conventional explanations for apparently anomalous evidence, and the tendency to treat absence of evidence as evidence of absence when it comes to the supposed destruction of advanced prehistoric civilizations. Geologists have demonstrated that there is no evidence of a large landmass sinking beneath the Atlantic Ocean in the time frame suggested by Plato's account, that the geology of the Atlantic seafloor shows no trace of a sunken continent, and that the mechanisms by which such a catastrophic subsidence could occur are unknown to science. Archaeologists have traced the development of human civilization through the patient excavation and analysis of countless sites around the world, constructing a detailed picture of how technology and culture evolved gradually over many millennia, a picture that leaves no room for a forgotten super-civilization from which all later achievements derived. And yet, the legend persists, undimmed by scientific skepticism, continuing to capture the imagination of new generations who discover the story for the first time. There is something in the human psyche that seems to require such legends, that finds comfort or excitement or meaning in the possibility of hidden knowledge and lost wonders, that resists the patient, incremental explanations of mainstream scholarship in favour of more dramatic narratives of rise and fall, of golden ages and catastrophic endings. Perhaps this is because the documented history of human civilization, for all its genuine achievements and wonders, contains so much that is painful and disappointing, so much failure and cruelty and waste, that we long for evidence of something better, some time when things were different, when human beings lived in greater harmony with each other and with the world, when knowledge and wisdom guided affairs rather than greed and ambition. Atlantis, in this reading, is less a place than an aspiration, a symbol of the civilization we wish we had been capable of creating, and the warning of what we might become if we lose our way. The influence of Atlantis on 20th century popular culture extended far beyond the realm of fringe speculation and alternative history. The legend became a staple of adventure fiction and film, providing the backdrop for countless tales of exploration and discovery, lost races and hidden treasures. Filmmakers found in Atlantis a setting of unparalleled visual potential, an opportunity to depict gleaming underwater cities, advanced technology beyond our own, and the dramatic moment of catastrophic destruction, the waves rising, the earth shaking, the great towers toppling into the sea. From early silent films through the blockbusters of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Atlantis has appeared again and again on screen, each production bringing its own visual imagination to the task of depicting the lost civilization. Comic books, animated films, and television series have all drawn upon the Atlantis legend, adapting it for young audiences and introducing new generations to the story that Plato first told so many centuries ago. The science fiction genre found in Atlantis a particularly rich source of inspiration, for the legend seemed to anticipate so many of the themes that would become central to speculative fiction. The rise and fall of civilizations, the dangers of technology misused, the possibility of advanced knowledge lost and perhaps recoverable. Writers imagined Atlantean technologies that resembled the innovations of the modern age, but that had been developed thousands of years earlier, power sources that might have been nuclear or even more exotic, aircraft and submarines and communication devices that would not seem out of place in a contemporary setting. Some writers incorporated Atlantis into larger cosmic narratives, suggesting that the Atlanteans had been in contact with extraterrestrial beings, that their advanced knowledge had come from the stars, that their downfall had been connected to events beyond the Earth. The ancient astronaut hypothesis, which proposes that many of the achievements of early human civilizations were inspired or assisted by visitors from other worlds, often incorporates Atlantis into its framework, treating the lost island as one of several sites where alien knowledge was transmitted to humanity before being lost in the mists of time. The academic study of Atlantis, meanwhile, has proceeded along more sober lines, focusing not on the search for a literal sunken island, but on the analysis of Plato's texts in their historical and philosophical context, on the transmission and reception of the legend across the centuries, and on the psychological and cultural functions that the story has served. Scholars have examined the ways in which Plato constructed his Atlantis narrative, identifying echoes of earlier Greek literary traditions, influences from Egyptian and Near Eastern sources, and connections to the philosophical themes that preoccupied Plato throughout his career. They have traced the history of Atlantis interpretation from antiquity through the medieval period to the modern era, documenting how each age has read its own concerns and preoccupations into the ancient tale. They have analysed the social and psychological appeal of lost civilization narratives, seeking to understand why such stories exert such a powerful hold on the human imagination, and what they reveal about the cultures that produce and consume them. One of the most enduring scholarly debates concerns the possible relationship between Plato's Atlantis and the real catastrophe that struck the Aegean world in the second millennium before the Common Era, the tremendous volcanic eruption of the island of Thera, known today as Santorini. This eruption, which occurred around 1600 before the Common Era, was one of the largest volcanic events in human history, a cataclysm that dwarfed the famous eruption of Vesuvius that destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum more than 1,000 years later. The centre of Thera collapsed into the sea, creating the great caldera that exists today, and the surrounding regions were devastated by ash falls, tsunamis, and the climatic disruptions that followed. The Minoan civilization, which had flourished on Crete and the surrounding islands, and which represented the first great maritime culture of the European world, was severely damaged by the eruption and its aftermath, and though it lingered on for some generations, it never recovered its former glory, eventually succumbing to conquest by the mainland Greeks, and fading from memory until its rediscovery by archaeologists in the early 20th century. The parallels between the destruction of Minoan Thera and the story of Atlantis are striking enough to have attracted the attention of scholars from many fields. Both accounts involve an advanced island civilization, sophisticated in its arts and its seafaring, that was struck down by a sudden natural catastrophe involving both earthquake and flood. Both suggest a culture that was highly developed and influential before its destruction, leaving behind echoes and memories that persisted long after the original civilization had vanished. The geographic discrepancies are significant, for Plato placed Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles in the Atlantic Ocean, while Thera lies in the Aegean, well within the Mediterranean world, and the chronological differences are even greater, for Plato dated the destruction of Atlantis 9,000 years before Solon's time, while the Theran eruption occurred roughly 900 years before the classical Greek period. But some scholars have suggested that these discrepancies might be explained by errors in transmission, that the story of a great island catastrophe in the Aegean might have travelled to Egypt and been preserved there, accumulating errors and exaggerations along the way, until Solon or Plato encountered it in a form already distant from its original context. This Theran hypothesis remains controversial among scholars, with some finding it a plausible explanation for the kernel of historical truth that might lie behind Plato's legend, and others dismissing it as an attempt to impose historical reality on what was always intended as philosophical fiction. The debate continues in academic journals and conferences, with new evidence and new interpretations appearing regularly, though no consensus has emerged and none may ever emerge. What can be said with certainty is that the destruction of Minoan Thera was a real event of tremendous magnitude, that it brought down one of the most sophisticated cultures of the ancient Mediterranean world, and that it left behind traces that can still be seen today in the dramatic caldera of Santorini, where the sea floods the space where the centre of the island once stood, and in the excavated ruins of Akrotiri, a Minoan town buried by volcanic ash and preserved in remarkable detail, its frescoes and its pottery and its multi-storey buildings offering a window into a world that existed before the catastrophe struck. The search for physical evidence of Atlantis, whether in the Aegean or elsewhere, has continued into the 21st century, aided by new technologies that allow for the exploration of the ocean floor and the detection of submerged structures. Satellite imagery, sonar mapping, and remotely operated vehicles have been deployed in the search for the lost island, probing the depths of the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and more distant waters in the hope of discovering some trace of the civilization that Plato described. Occasional announcements of discoveries that might be connected to Atlantis make their way into the popular press, generating excitement and debate before fading from view as the evidence proves inconclusive or the interpretations prove unsupportable. The underwater realm remains vast and largely unexplored, and it is always possible, in the gaps of our knowledge, to imagine that something might yet be found, some artifact or structure or inscription that would transform the legend into documented history. The persistence of this search reflects something deeper than mere curiosity about ancient history, a longing that seems to be built into the human condition, a desire to believe that the world holds secrets yet to be revealed, that the past was richer and stranger than we have been told, that somewhere beneath the waves or beneath the sands there waits a discovery that would change everything we think we know. Atlantis has become the ultimate symbol of this desire, the archetype of the lost and recoverable, the paradise that might yet be found if only we look in the right place with the right eyes. And whether or not any physical Atlantis ever existed, this symbolic Atlantis is undeniably real. A structure built not of stone and metal but of hope and imagination. A city that exists in the mind of humanity, and that has stood there for more than 2,000 years. The philosophical dimensions of the Atlantis story have also continued to attract scholarly attention, for Plato's tale raises questions that remain relevant to contemporary discussions of ethics, politics, and the nature of civilization. The central moral of the Atlantis narrative, the corruption of a virtuous society by wealth and power, the gradual dilution of what was noble and good, the divine punishment that follows upon pride and injustice, speaks to concerns that have occupied thinkers in every age. How does a society maintain its virtue in the face of success and abundance? How can power be exercised without corrupting those who hold it? What are the limits that must be observed if civilization is to endure, and what happens when those limits are transgressed? These questions, which Plato raised through his story of the fall of Atlantis, remain as pressing today as they were in the 4th century before the Common Era, perhaps more pressing in an age when human power over nature and over each other has grown to dimensions that the ancient world could not have imagined. The contrast that Plato drew between the corrupted Atlantis and the virtuous ancient Athens was itself a philosophical device, a way of examining by comparison what makes a society good or bad, what leads to flourishing and what leads to downfall. The Athens that Plato described in the Timaeus and the Chrysias was not the real Athens of his own day, with all its imperfections and conflicts, but an idealized Athens of the distant past, a model of what a just society might look like, disciplined and harmonious, governed by wisdom and devoted to virtue. This ideal Athens stood against Atlantis as a standard of judgment, showing by its victory over the corrupt empire that virtue is stronger than vice, that the seemingly weaker can triumph over the seemingly stronger when justice is on its side. The story was thus a meditation not only on what had been lost, but on what might yet be achieved, a call to Athens and to humanity to aspire to something better than the pursuit of wealth and power, to remember that true happiness lies not in material abundance but in the cultivation of the soul. These philosophical themes have resonated with readers across the centuries, finding new applications in each successive age. The warning against hubris, the dangers of expansion and conquest, the corruption that follows upon material success, the punishment that awaits those who abandon virtue for ambition. All these elements of the Atlantis story have been invoked by moralists and critics who have seen in contemporary societies the same patterns that Plato described in his ancient tale. The legend has been used to criticize imperialism and colonialism, to warn against environmental destruction and the exploitation of natural resources, to caution against the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few, to remind us that no civilization, however mighty, is permanent, and that all human achievements exist at the mercy of forces beyond our control. In this sense, Atlantis functions not only as a memory of what was lost, but as a prophecy of what might yet be lost, a reminder that the present age, for all its unprecedented power and complexity, is subject to the same laws that governed the rise and fall of civilizations in the past. The environmental dimensions of the Atlantis story have attracted particular attention in recent decades, as awareness of climate change and ecological crisis has grown throughout the world. The image of a great civilization swallowed by the rising seas takes on new resonance in an age when scientists predict significant sea level rise as a consequence of global warming, when coastal cities and island nations face the prospect of inundation within the coming century, when the very possibility of catastrophic change to the conditions of human existence has moved from speculation to documented scientific concern. Some have seen in the Atlantis legend a warning from the deep past, a reminder that human civilizations exist in a delicate balance with their environment, and that the forces of nature, when unleashed, can sweep away in a moment what took generations to build. Others have noted the irony that we may be creating the conditions for our own Atlantis, a technological civilization of unprecedented scope and power that may be undermining the very foundations upon which it stands. The 20th century saw catastrophes on a scale that earlier ages could not have conceived. 2 world wars that killed tens of millions, genocides and famines, and the development of weapons capable of destroying civilization itself. In the shadow of these events, the story of Atlantis took on new significance, no longer a quaint legend from the ancient world, but a parable that spoke directly to the conditions of modern existence. The mushroom cloud rising over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the apocalyptic visions of nuclear war that haunted the Cold War decades, the slow accumulation of environmental damage that has become increasingly difficult to ignore, all these have given the Atlantis story a contemporary relevance that Plato could not have anticipated. The Lost Island has become a mirror in which we see reflected our own fears and our own possibilities, a reminder that the choices we make as a civilization have consequences that may extend far beyond our own lifetimes. And so the story of Atlantis continues, not as a fixed and finished legend, but as a living tradition that grows and changes with each generation that receives it. A story that means different things to different people at different times, yet retains at its core the same essential elements that Plato first set down in his dialogues so many centuries ago. There is the vision of splendour and achievement, the gleaming city with its temples and harbours and intricate rings of water and land. There is the gradual corruption, the fading of virtue, the rise of pride and ambition. There is the judgment, the catastrophe, the single terrible day and night when everything was lost. And there is the silence that follows, the unbroken surface of the sea, the passing of memory, the long ages during which the story was preserved only in distant records until it emerged again into the light of human attention. We have followed this story from its source in the writings of Plato, through the centuries of interpretation and speculation that followed, through the modern age of exploration and scholarship and popular fascination. We have considered the question of whether Atlantis was ever a real place, and we have seen that this question, which might seem simple, opens onto deeper mysteries about the nature of history and legend, about what we can know and what we can only imagine. We have touched upon the many meanings that the story has carried across the ages, the philosophical lessons and the spiritual speculations, the warnings and the inspirations that different people have drawn from the ancient tale. Yet there is more to be said, for the influence of Atlantis extends into realms we have not yet explored, into the arts and the imagination, into the deepest questions about human nature and human destiny. The legend has shaped not only what we think about the past, but also how we think about the future, not only our understanding of history, but also our dreams of what might yet be achieved or lost. In the continuing chapters of this story, we shall follow these threads further, tracing the image of Atlantis through the galleries of art and the pages of literature, examining the ways in which the legend has informed our understanding of ourselves and our place in the world. For now, let us rest with the image that Plato left us, the great island slumbering beneath the Atlantic waves, its glory and its shame both dissolved into the peace of the deep, its temples and its towers silent in the green twilight of the ocean floor, its story preserved in a few pages of ancient Greek text and in the endless unfolding of human imagination. The sailors who pass over that stretch of water know nothing of what lies beneath, and the fish that swim through those depths are oblivious to the ruins they might brush against with their passing fins. The current flows, the years accumulate, the memory fades and revives and transforms itself, and still the legend endures, bright and strange, calling to us across the ages with its tale of wonders, lost, and lessons yet to be learned. The artistic imagination has always been drawn to the theme of lost civilizations, to the image of grandeur reduced to ruin, of human achievement reclaimed by the indifferent forces of nature. And among all the lost civilizations that have captured the attention of painters and sculptors and poets, Atlantis has held a special place, precisely because it exists at the boundary between history and myth, between the tangible and the imagined. An artist depicting the fall of Rome or the destruction of Pompeii works within constraints, for there are archaeological remains to consult, written accounts to honour, a factual record against which the artistic vision must be measured. But an artist approaching Atlantis is free in a way that few historical subjects permit, free to imagine the city in whatever form best serves the vision, free to populate it with whatever architecture and costume and atmosphere the imagination can supply, bound only by the few tantalizing details that Plato provided, and by the expectations of an audience that has itself been imagining Atlantis for centuries. The earliest artistic responses to the Atlantis legend were literary rather than visual, for painting and sculpture in the ancient world did not typically concern themselves with narrative scenes from philosophical dialogues. The poets and playwrights of antiquity, had they wished to dramatize the story, would have found in it all the elements of great tragedy, the noble origins, the gradual corruption, the divine judgment, the catastrophic fall. Yet curiously, the ancient dramatists seem not to have taken up the theme. No play about Atlantis survives from the Greek or Roman theatre, no epic poem celebrating or lamenting its fall. The story remained embedded in Plato's philosophical works, discussed by scholars and commentators but not translated into the forms of popular entertainment that might have spread it more widely through ancient culture. This relative neglect may reflect the ambiguous status of the tale even in antiquity, the uncertainty about whether it was meant as history or fiction, the difficulty of dramatising a story whose climax consisted of a natural disaster rather than human action, the absence of individual heroes whose fates could anchor the audience's sympathies. The situation changed dramatically in the modern era, particularly from the 19th century onward, when the combination of romantic sensibility and advancing archaeological discovery created a new appetite for stories of ancient wonders and lost civilizations. The excavation of Troy by Heinrich Schliemann in the 1870s demonstrated that places long thought legendary could have archaeological reality, and this revelation sent ripples through the popular imagination. If Troy was real, why not Atlantis? The discovery of the extraordinary Minoan civilization on Crete by Arthur Evans at the turn of the 20th century added further fuel to the speculation, presenting the public with images of a sophisticated Bronze Age culture that had flourished and then mysteriously declined, with its elaborate palaces and its sophisticated art, its apparent dominance of the Eastern Mediterranean in an age before the rise of classical Greece. For many observers, the Minoans seem like a glimpse of what Atlantis might have been, a preview of the splendours that might yet be discovered beneath the waves of the Western Ocean. In this atmosphere of archaeological excitement and romantic speculation, artists began to visualize Atlantis with increasing frequency and ambition. The painters of the 19th and early 20th centuries, trained in the academic tradition of historical and mythological subjects, found in Atlantis an opportunity to deploy all their skills in the service of an imaginative reconstruction. These artists drew upon a repertoire of visual conventions that had been developed for depicting other ancient civilizations, borrowing elements from Egyptian and Babylonian and classical Greek art to create composite images of Atlantean splendor. They painted temples of massive columns and gleaming marble, palaces adorned with gold and precious stones, harbours crowded with galleys and merchant ships, gardens of tropical luxuriance, and always, hovering over the scene, the threat of impending doom, the dark clouds gathering on the horizon, the first tremors running through the earth, the waters beginning to rise. The particular challenge of depicting Atlantis lay in capturing not just the splendour but the fall, not just the achievement but the catastrophe. The most powerful images of Atlantis in Western art have typically been images of destruction, attempting to render visible the unimaginable moment when the great civilization was swallowed by the sea. These paintings often drew upon an established tradition of disaster imagery, the depictions of the deluge and of Sodom and Gomorrah, and of the last days that religious art had developed over centuries, the visual vocabulary of divine judgment, of fire falling from heaven and waters rising from below, of tiny human figures dwarfed by cosmic forces, was readily adapted to the Atlantean theme. Artists placed their gleaming temples and towers against backgrounds of storm and upheaval, showing the moment when human pride encounters the overwhelming power of nature and of divine retribution, when all the accumulated wealth and wisdom of a great civilization proves powerless against the forces unleashed by the displeasure of the gods. The influence of Atlantis on the literary imagination has been equally profound, though it has taken different forms in different periods. The novelists and storytellers who have engaged with the theme have approached it from many angles, some treating Atlantis as a setting for adventure and romance, others using it as a vehicle for philosophical or political speculation, still others finding in its destruction a framework for meditation on the meaning of civilization itself. The flexibility of the legend has allowed it to serve many different literary purposes, to be reimagined in countless variations while retaining the essential core of meaning that Plato first established. Among the most influential literary treatments of the Atlantis theme have been those that imagine the survival of Atlantean knowledge, or Atlantean people into later ages. The notion that the destruction of the island was not complete, that some refugees escaped to found new civilizations elsewhere, carrying with them the advanced wisdom of their doomed homeland. This motif of Atlantean survival has proven extraordinarily durable, appearing in works of both popular fiction and esoteric speculation. It offers a way of connecting the ancient legend to the ongoing story of human civilization, suggesting that the achievements of Atlantis were not entirely lost but were preserved and transmitted, forming hidden streams of influence that have shaped history in ways that are not immediately visible. The pyramids of Egypt, the megalithic monuments of Europe, the sophisticated astronomical knowledge of ancient peoples, all these have been attributed in various speculative accounts to the influence of Atlantean refugees who brought with them the learning of their lost homeland. Jules Verne, in his novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, published in 1870, included a memorable episode in which Captain Nemo guides the narrator through the underwater ruins of Atlantis, an experience of haunting beauty and melancholy that captured the imagination of readers around the world. Verne's depiction drew upon the romantic tradition of sublime ruins, the contemplation of fallen grandeur that had been a favourite theme of poets and painters since the 18th century. The image of the submarine Nautilus moving silently through the drowned streets of the ancient city, its electric lights illuminating columns and temples that had not seen light for thousands of years, became one of the iconic moments of 19th century literature, helping to establish a visual and emotional template for the lost city that would influence countless later works. The 20th century brought new forms of narrative media to the task of imagining Atlantis, as the development of cinema offered unprecedented opportunities for visual spectacle, and the emerging genres of science fiction and fantasy provided new frameworks for understanding the legend. The Atlantis of modern popular culture has often been a place of advanced technology as well as great beauty, a civilization that had achieved scientific understanding beyond our own before some catastrophe, natural or self-inflicted, brought it to an end. This interpretation reflects the ambivalent relationship that modern society has with its own technological achievements, the awareness that our power to create is matched by our power to destroy, that the same knowledge that raises us to new heights of capability might also be the instrument of our downfall. The Atomic Age, in particular, gave new resonance to the story of Atlantis, for here was a civilization that had apparently reached the pinnacle of development only to be annihilated in a single cataclysmic event, a scenario that seemed disturbingly relevant to a world that had witnessed the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that lived under the shadow of potential nuclear war. The pulp adventure stories of the early 20th century embraced Atlantis with enthusiasm, sending their heroes to discover hidden valleys where Atlantean descendants still survived, or to dive beneath the waves to explore the submerged ruins, or to uncover Atlantean artifacts that held the key to forgotten powers. These stories, published in magazines with lurid covers and breathless prose, did much to embed the image of Atlantis in the popular consciousness of the English-speaking world, establishing conventions and expectations that would persist through later decades of film and television and video games. The Atlantis of this tradition was typically a place of wonder and danger, of beautiful princesses and sinister priests, of death traps and treasure chambers, of ancient wisdom preserved in mysterious forms awaiting the hero who could unlock its secrets. More serious works of literary fiction have also engaged with the Atlantis theme, often using the legend as a framework for exploring questions about the nature of civilization and the possibility of social and moral progress. The utopian tradition, which Plato himself helped to establish through his dialogues on the ideal republic, has frequently found in Atlantis a useful counterexample, a vision of how even the most advanced civilization can go wrong when it loses touch with the virtues that sustained its rise. Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, published posthumously in 1627, used the name and the associations of the legend to present a vision of an ideal scientific society, an island civilization called Bensalem that had achieved wisdom and prosperity through the systematic pursuit of knowledge, offering a positive counterpart to the corrupted splendour of Plato's original. Bacon's work was tremendously influential in the development of modern scientific culture, helping to establish the idea that the organised pursuit of knowledge could transform society for the better, and its choice of the Atlantis reference was deliberate, an attempt to reclaim the legend from its associations with downfall and destruction, and to redirect it toward a vision of progress and enlightenment. The philosophical implications of the Atlantis story have been explored by thinkers of many different traditions, who have found in it a rich source of meditation on the relationship between power and virtue, between material prosperity and spiritual health, between the achievements of civilization and the ever-present possibility of catastrophic loss. The story presents, in mythic form, one of the central questions of political philosophy. What causes civilizations to rise and to fall, and what, if anything, can be done to prevent the corruption that seems to accompany success and power? Plato's answer, as expressed through the structure of the Atlantis narrative, was that the health of a civilization depends ultimately on the virtue of its people, and that virtue is fragile, easily diluted by the very prosperity that it helps to create. The divine blood that had made the Atlanteans great was progressively weakened by admixture with mortal nature, just as Plato believed that the higher faculties of the soul could be overwhelmed by the lower appetites if proper education and discipline were not maintained. The story of Atlantis thus served as an illustration of themes that Plato developed more systematically in his other dialogues: the insistence that the good life depends on the proper ordering of the soul, and that the proper ordering of society depends on the proper ordering of the souls of its citizens. This philosophical framework has given the Atlantis legend a depth of meaning that goes beyond mere fascination with lost splendour or catastrophic destruction. The story invites reflection on the nature of human nature itself, on the tension between our capacity for greatness and our susceptibility to corruption, on the ways in which our greatest strengths can become the sources of our deepest weaknesses. A civilization that grows wealthy may grow complacent. A people that achieves power may grow proud. A society that masters the forces of nature may come to believe that it has mastered the forces of morality as well, that it has risen above the constraints that bind lesser peoples. The fate of Atlantis stands as a warning against such hubris, a reminder that the gods, or nature, or the inner logic of historical development, or whatever force one believes governs the rise and fall of civilizations, is not mocked, that the bills eventually come due, that the consequences of moral failure, however long delayed, arrive at last with devastating force. The religious and spiritual interpretations of Atlantis have formed another important strand in the long history of the legend's reception. From the earliest Christian centuries, some commentators sought to reconcile the Atlantis story with the biblical account of history, identifying the destruction of the island with the flood of Noah or with other divine judgments recorded in Scripture. This approach treated Plato's account as a garbled or partial version of a genuine tradition that had been more accurately preserved in the Hebrew Scriptures, allowing Atlantis to be incorporated into a unified sacred history of the world. Later, esoteric traditions developed far more elaborate systems of Atlantean spirituality, claiming special knowledge of the religious practices and mystical attainments of the lost civilization, knowledge that had supposedly been preserved through secret lineages and occult initiations. The theosophical movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries made Atlantis a central element in its cosmology, teaching that the Atlanteans had been one of the root races of humanity, possessed of psychic powers and spiritual knowledge that had been lost when their civilization was destroyed, but that could be recovered by those who followed the proper path of initiation and development. These esoteric interpretations, whatever one may think of their claims to special knowledge, reflect a persistent human desire to believe that there is more to reality than meets the eye, that behind the visible world of ordinary experience lies a hidden world of deeper meaning and power. Atlantis, precisely because it is lost, becomes a convenient repository for such hopes and beliefs. Whatever cannot be found in the known world can be attributed to Atlantis. Whatever mysteries remain unsolved can be explained by reference to Atlantean wisdom that has been forgotten or concealed. The flexibility of the legend, its resistance to definitive disproof, makes it an ideal vehicle for this kind of speculation, allowing each generation of seekers to project onto the blank screen of the submerged island their own particular vision of what has been lost and what might be recovered. The scientific study of the Atlantis legend represents yet another dimension of its long reception history, a tradition of scholarly inquiry that has sought to understand the origins and meaning of the story through the methods of historical and archaeological research. This tradition begins in antiquity, with the debates among Plato's own students and successors about whether the master had intended his account as fact or fiction. Aristotle, Plato's most famous pupil, reportedly believed that Atlantis was a philosophical fiction, invented to illustrate a moral point, a view that has been shared by the majority of classical scholars ever since. Yet the alternative view, that Plato was recording some genuine tradition of a real lost civilization, has never entirely disappeared, and in the modern era it has been pursued with the tools of archaeology, geology, oceanography, and comparative mythology. The search for a historical kernel behind the Atlantis legend has focused on several possible candidates, each with its own strengths and weaknesses as a match for Plato's description. The Minoan civilization, centred on Crete and destroyed by the volcanic eruption of Thera around 1450 before the Common Era, remains one of the most frequently cited possibilities, offering a sophisticated island culture that met a sudden and catastrophic end within the general region of the ancient Greek world. The fit is not perfect, for the Minoans were in the Aegean rather than the Atlantic, and the date of their destruction is far more recent than the 9,000 years before Solon that Plato specified. but proponents of the identification argue that these discrepancies could be explained by errors in transmission or by deliberate alterations on Plato's part. Other candidates have been proposed in locations ranging from the coast of Spain to the islands of the Caribbean, from the plains of Anatolia to the ice-covered continent of Antarctica, each theory offering its own explanation for why Plato's description does not quite match the proposed site. The geological evidence for the existence of a large landmass in the Atlantic Ocean that sank beneath the waves in relatively recent geological time is, it must be said, decidedly negative. Modern oceanographic surveys have mapped the floor of the Atlantic in considerable detail, and while there are indeed underwater mountains and ridges, there is no sign of a continental shelf or sunken island of the dimensions that Plato described. The theory of plate tectonics, which explains the formation and movement of continents over geological time, provides no mechanism by which a large island could sink rapidly beneath the sea. The processes that create and destroy land masses operate on timescales of millions of years, not the single day and night of Plato's account. The consensus of geological science is that no Atlantic Atlantis ever existed, that the ocean basin has maintained roughly its present form throughout the entire period of human existence on Earth, and that any search for a literal sunken continent in those waters is searching for something that was never there. Yet the absence of geological evidence for an Atlantic Atlantis does not necessarily settle the question of whether some historical event or place inspired Plato's account. It is possible, as many scholars have suggested, that the philosopher drew upon traditions of real events that had been transformed and magnified by the processes of oral transmission, that distant memories of the Minoan collapse or of other historical disasters were woven together with philosophical invention to create the compelling narrative that has come down to us. In this view, Atlantis would be neither pure fact nor pure fiction, but something in between, a literary creation that incorporated genuine historical elements while transforming them into a form that served Plato's philosophical purposes. The question of historical truth thus becomes a question about the nature of historical memory, about how traditions are transmitted and transformed across generations, about the relationship between what happened and how it is remembered and recorded. The comparative study of mythology has revealed that stories of drowned lands and catastrophic floods are remarkably widespread among the cultures of the world, appearing in traditions from every inhabited continent. The biblical story of Noah's flood is only the most familiar of countless such narratives, tales that describe a time when the waters rose and swallowed the land, destroying all or most of humanity and forcing the survivors to begin again. The prevalence of these stories has been interpreted in various ways. Some have seen in them a universal memory of real events, perhaps the flooding of coastal lowlands at the end of the last ice age, when rising sea levels transformed the geography of the world, submerging vast areas that had been dry land during the glacial period. Others have seen the flood myths as expressions of psychological or spiritual truths, reflections of the universal human experience of mortality and vulnerability, of the fragility of all we build against the overwhelming forces of nature. Still others have argued that the prevalence of flood stories simply reflects the universal human experience of actual floods, events that occur in every region of the world where people live near water and that naturally become incorporated into the mythological traditions of the affected communities. The story of Atlantis fits within this broader pattern of catastrophe mythology, while also standing apart from it in significant ways. Unlike most flood narratives, which focus on the survival of a chosen individual or family who become the ancestors of a renewed humanity, the Atlantis story emphasizes total destruction, the annihilation of an entire civilization with no survivors to carry its legacy forward. The moral element, while present in many flood traditions, is particularly emphasized in Plato's account, which makes the corruption of Atlantean virtue the explicit cause of divine punishment, and the specificity of Plato's description, the detailed geography and architecture and social organization of the lost island, is unusual among flood narratives, which typically concern themselves more with the catastrophe itself and its aftermath than with the civilization that was destroyed. These distinctive features suggest that Plato, if he was indeed drawing upon older flood traditions, substantially reworked and developed them to serve his own particular purposes, creating a narrative that is at once typical of the catastrophe mythology found around the world and unique in its philosophical depth and imaginative elaboration. The influence of the Atlantis legend on Western culture has been so pervasive that it is difficult to trace all its ramifications. The image of the sunken city has become a standard element of our imaginative vocabulary, available for deployment in contexts that have nothing directly to do with Plato's original story. When we speak of something as an Atlantis, we invoke a whole complex of associations, the idea of lost splendour, of catastrophic downfall, of wisdom swallowed by the waves of time, of secrets preserved in the depths waiting to be discovered. The legend has become a lens through which we see other stories of loss and decline, a template that shapes how we understand and respond to the fall of civilizations throughout history. The decline and fall of Rome, the collapse of the ancient Maya, the destruction of cultures by colonialism and conquest. All these historical events are filtered, consciously or unconsciously, through the framework that the Atlantis story provides, the archetypal narrative of greatness undone. The continuing vitality of the Atlantis legend in contemporary culture reflects, perhaps, a particular anxiety of our own age, the awareness that our civilization, for all its achievements, remains vulnerable to catastrophic disruption. The 20th century, with its world wars and genocides and nuclear weapons, demonstrated with terrible clarity that the progress of civilization is not guaranteed, that advances in knowledge and power do not automatically translate into advances in wisdom and virtue. The 21st century has brought new forms of existential risk to public attention, the possibility of climate catastrophe, of engineered pandemics, of artificial intelligence systems that escape human control, of resource depletion and ecosystem collapse. In this context, the story of Atlantis resonates with particular force, for it is the story of a civilization that had achieved great things, and then, through its own failures of virtue and judgment, brought destruction upon itself. The parallel to our own situation is obvious and uncomfortable, and it is perhaps not surprising that the legend continues to capture the imagination of audiences who sense, however dimly, that the fate of Atlantis might have something to teach us about our own prospects. The image of the sunken city continues to appear in the dreams and the art and the stories of our time, transformed into countless variations but retaining always the essential elements that Plato first set down. We see it in the fantastical cities of science fiction, in the drowned worlds of climate fiction, in the archaeological adventures of popular cinema, in the video games that send players exploring beneath virtual waves. We see it in the New Age bookshops and the conspiracy websites, where the mysteries of Atlantis are offered as keys to unlock the hidden truths of the universe. We see it in the continuing stream of books and documentaries that propose new theories about where the Lost Island might lie, each one claiming to have solved at last the mystery that has tantalized humanity for millennia. The legend adapts and persists, taking on new forms to meet the needs of each new generation, its essential power undiminished by the passage of time or the accumulation of scholarly skepticism. And perhaps this persistence tells us something important about the nature of stories themselves, about their capacity to carry meaning across vast distances of time and culture, to speak to human beings in circumstances utterly different from those in which they were first told. A story that has endured for nearly 2.5 millennia, that has been told and retold in countless languages and artistic forms, that has survived the rise and fall of empires and religions and scientific paradigms, is not merely a piece of entertainment or a specimen for scholarly analysis. It is a living presence in human culture, a vessel that carries accumulated meaning from generation to generation, a mirror in which each age sees its own face reflected back with strange and revealing distortions. The story of Atlantis is such a vessel, such a mirror, and its continuing relevance suggests that the questions it raises about the relationship between power and virtue, about the fragility of civilization, about the meaning of loss and the possibility of recovery, are questions that human beings will continue to ask as long as they continue to build cities and dream dreams and wonder about their place in the vast sweep of time. The question of what Atlantis means, then, extends far beyond the question of whether it ever existed as a physical place beneath the waters of any actual ocean. For the legend has become something larger than geography, something that transcends the mere facts of historical archaeology or geological surveys of the Atlantic seabed. It has become a meditation on the nature of human civilization itself, on the trajectories that societies follow as they rise and flourish and decline, on the patterns that seem to recur across different times and places with troubling regularity. And to understand this dimension of the Atlantis story, we must look more closely at what Plato was actually trying to teach through his tale, at the philosophical purposes that shaped his invention and that continue to give it meaning for readers who encounter it today. Plato was not, after all, merely telling a story for the pleasure of storytelling, though he was certainly capable of taking pleasure in the craft of narrative. He was engaged throughout his writing life in a sustained investigation of the deepest questions that human beings can ask. Questions about the nature of reality and knowledge, about justice and the good life, about how societies should be organised, and how individuals should conduct themselves within those societies. The dialogues in which the Atlantis story appears, the Timaeus and the Critias, are part of a larger philosophical project that occupied Plato in his later years, a project concerned with the origins of the universe, the structure of the cosmos, and the relationship between the natural order and the human order. The story of Atlantis fits into this larger framework as an illustration of certain principles that Plato believed to be fundamental to the proper understanding of political life. The contrast at the heart of the narrative is between two kinds of society, or perhaps between two states of the same society at different stages of its development. On one hand, there is the ancient Athens that Plato describes, a city that existed in his telling 9,000 years before the time of Solon, a city organised according to principles that Plato clearly admires and that reflect many of the ideals he had developed in his most famous work, the Republic. This ancient Athens was a society in which different classes of citizens each performed their proper functions, in which the guardians and warriors who defended the city lived communally, without private property or family attachments that might distract them from their duties, in which the whole social order was arranged to promote virtue and the common good rather than the accumulation of private wealth. It was, in other words, something close to the ideal state that Plato had theorized, a society governed by wisdom and dedicated to justice, strong enough to defend itself against any aggressor while remaining uncorrupted by the temptations that accompany military power. On the other hand, there is Atlantis, which represents a very different model of civilization. Atlantis is a society of extraordinary material abundance, blessed with natural resources beyond measure, adorned with magnificent architecture and elaborate works of engineering, possessed of wealth and power that far exceeded anything the Greeks of Plato's day could imagine. And yet this very abundance in Plato's telling becomes the source of the civilization's corruption and ultimate destruction. For as long as the descendants of Poseidon retained their divine nature, they were able to bear their prosperity with temperance and wisdom, regarding their material wealth as relatively unimportant compared to the goods of the soul. But as the divine element within them weakened, diluted by successive generations of mixture with mortal nature, they lost the capacity to keep their desires in proper order. They began to value their possessions more than their virtues, to pursue power for its own sake rather than as a means to good ends, to become, in Plato's language, filled with unrighteous ambition and greed. The splendour that had once been the outward expression of inner excellence became instead a mask concealing inner corruption, a glittering facade that hid the decay within. This transformation from virtue to corruption is central to Plato's understanding of political life, and it helps to explain why the Atlantis story has continued to resonate with readers across the centuries. For Plato believed that all political societies tend over time to degenerate from their original condition toward increasingly corrupt forms. In the Republic, he had traced a sequence of decline through which the ideal state gives way first to timocracy, a society ruled by those who love honour and military glory, then to oligarchy ruled by the wealthy, then to democracy, characterised by an excess of freedom and equality, and finally to tyranny, the worst form of government in which a single ruler uses force and deception to gratify his own desires at the expense of everyone else. This pattern of decline is not inevitable in every detail, but Plato clearly believed that there are powerful forces within human nature and human society that tend to pull political communities away from virtue and toward corruption, away from the common good and toward the pursuit of private advantage. The story of Atlantis can be read as a mythological expression of this same insight. The island empire begins in a state of grace, founded by a god, ruled by kings of divine blood, blessed with every natural advantage, and possessed of the wisdom to use those advantages well. But over time, the divine element weakens, the human element grows stronger, and the society loses its way. The very gifts that had made Atlantis great become the instruments of its corruption, as wealth and power, no longer guided by virtue, turn toward conquest and domination. And finally, when the corruption has reached its limit, the gods intervene to destroy what has become a threat to the order of the cosmos, sweeping the whole magnificent civilization into the sea in a single catastrophic judgment. There is something deeply pessimistic in this vision, or at least something that modern readers might perceive as pessimistic, a sense that human achievements are inherently unstable, that prosperity contains the seeds of its own destruction, that the very qualities that enable a society to rise to greatness will eventually bring about its downfall. But Plato's intention was not simply to counsel despair. He believed that understanding the patterns of political decline could help human beings to resist them, that philosophy could illuminate the path to a more stable and just society, and that the ideal state, though difficult to establish and maintain, was not beyond the reach of human aspiration. The story of Atlantis serves as a warning, not as a prophecy of inevitable doom, showing what happens when wisdom is neglected and virtue is abandoned, so that those who hear the tale might be moved to choose a different path. This dimension of the legend helps to explain why it has appealed so strongly to moralists and reformers across the ages, to those who have seen in their own societies the same tendencies toward corruption that Plato diagnosed in Atlantis. The story provides a narrative framework for thinking about civilizational decline, a way of organizing observations about social ills into a coherent pattern that suggests both diagnosis and, implicitly, remedy. If the problem is that material prosperity has corrupted a society's values, then the solution must involve some kind of spiritual or moral renewal, a recovery of the virtues that have been lost, a turning away from the pursuit of wealth and power toward higher goods. If the divine element has become too weak, then it must be strengthened somehow, through education or religion or some other form of cultural transformation that can restore the proper hierarchy of values. This pattern of thought has recurred again and again in Western history, appearing in different forms and with different specific content, but always retaining the essential structure that Plato established. The Roman moralists who lamented the corruption of republican virtue in the days of the empire, the medieval monks who saw in the fall of Rome a judgment upon worldly ambition, the Renaissance humanists who sought to recover the lost wisdom of the ancients, the Enlightenment philosophers who blamed the church and the aristocracy for humanity's failure to progress, the romantic critics of industrial capitalism who mourned the destruction of traditional communities, the modern environmentalists who warn of ecological catastrophe. All of these diverse movements and thinkers have drawn, whether consciously or not, upon the same pattern of decline and potential renewal that Plato embedded in the Atlantis story. The legend also raises profound questions about the relationship between knowledge and power, between technological capability and moral wisdom. Atlantis was, in Plato's telling, a civilization of remarkable sophistication, possessed of engineering knowledge that enabled the construction of vast canals and harbours and bridges, of architectural skill that produced temples and palaces of extraordinary grandeur, of organisational capacity that could mobilise enormous armies and fleets for military conquest. And yet all this knowledge and capability could not save the Atlanteans from themselves. Their technological mastery was not accompanied by corresponding moral development, and when the human passions of greed and ambition and the lust for power came to dominate their society, their very capabilities became instruments of destruction rather than of flourishing. This aspect of the legend speaks with particular force to our own age, an age in which human technological capabilities have grown to truly planetary scale, while human wisdom seems to have remained at roughly the same level it has always been. We possess the power to reshape the climate of the entire Earth, to modify the genetic code of living organisms, to create artificial systems capable of performing tasks that once seemed exclusively human, to destroy ourselves many times over with nuclear weapons. And yet we continue to be motivated by the same passions that have always driven human beings, by fear and greed and tribal loyalty, and the desire for status and recognition, by all the complicated impulses that make us what we are. The Atlantean predicament is recognisably our own, the predicament of a species whose reach has come to exceed its grasp, whose powers have outstripped its capacity to use them wisely. Whether Plato foresaw anything like our modern situation is, of course, impossible to say. He lived in a world of city-states and sailing ships, of bronze and iron, of human and animal labour, a world in which the greatest technological achievements were monumental buildings and aqueducts and roads. The machines that have transformed modern life would have been incomprehensible to him, though perhaps not the human motivations that produced them. But the pattern he identified, the disproportion between power and wisdom, between what human beings can do and what they should do, seems as relevant now as it was in 4th century Athens. The story of Atlantis reminds us that great capabilities bring great responsibilities, that the possession of power does not automatically confer the wisdom to use it well, and that civilizations can fail catastrophically and completely when they forget these truths. The religious and spiritual dimensions of the legend also deserve attention, for the Atlantis story is not merely a political parable, but also a tale about the relationship between human beings and the divine. The civilization of Atlantis was founded by a god and sustained for generations by the divine element that flowed through the veins of its rulers. Its eventual destruction came as a divine judgment, decreed by Zeus and the assembled gods in response to human corruption and overreach. The pattern is one that appears in many religious traditions, the story of humanity receiving divine gifts, using them well for a time, then succumbing to pride and disobedience, and finally suffering catastrophic punishment. The parallel to the biblical stories of the Garden of Eden, of the Tower of Babel, of the flood that destroyed all but Noah and his family, have often been noted, and some have suggested that these parallel narratives point to some common memory or some universal pattern embedded deep in the human psyche. Whether or not such connections exist, the religious dimension of the Atlantis story has contributed to its enduring power, for it suggests that human history is not merely a sequence of accidents, that the rise and fall of civilizations is not random, but follows some kind of meaningful pattern, that there is a moral order to the universe that responds to human virtue and vice, rewarding the former and punishing the latter. This is a comforting thought for those who suffer under unjust systems, for it promises that the wicked will not prosper forever, that the proud will eventually be brought low, that divine justice will prevail even if human justice fails. And it is a chastening thought for those who enjoy power and prosperity, reminding them that their position is not secure, that they too are subject to judgment, that their own corruption could bring upon them the fate of Atlantis. The modern secular world has largely abandoned the belief in divine judgment that underlies this dimension of the legend, substituting natural processes for supernatural intervention, explaining the rise and fall of civilizations in terms of geography, climate, economics, disease, and the complex dynamics of social systems rather than the decrees of the gods. And yet the moral framework of the story persists, translated into secular terms. We may not believe that Zeus will judge our civilization, but we do believe, many of us, that civilizations that ignore ecological limits, or that fail to address social injustice, or that allow wealth and power to concentrate in too few hands will eventually face consequences, not from angry gods, but from the inexorable workings of natural and social systems. The vocabulary has changed, but the underlying pattern of thought remains recognizably similar to what Plato set down all those centuries ago. The aesthetic dimension of the Atlantis legend is also worth considering, for part of its enduring appeal lies simply in its beauty, in the vivid and detailed picture that Plato painted of a magnificent civilization at the height of its glory. The concentric rings of water and land, the bridges and tunnels connecting them, the great canal reaching to the sea, the temples and palaces sheathed in precious metals, the hot springs and cold springs, the harbours crowded with ships, the fertile plains stretching to the distant mountains, all of these images have lodged themselves in the human imagination and have continued to inspire artists and storytellers for millennia. There is a reason why architects and urban planners have been drawn to circular and concentric designs, why artists have painted and sculpted visions of drowned cities, why filmmakers have created vast digital recreations of underwater civilizations glittering with gold and coral. The image of Atlantis satisfies something deep in the human aesthetic sense, a longing for order and symmetry and magnificence, for a place where every element fits perfectly into its proper position, and the whole achieves a harmony that eludes us in our ordinary experience. The pathos of the story deepens this aesthetic appeal, for the beauty of Atlantis is always already lost, always viewed across an unbridgeable gulf of time and catastrophe. We encounter the civilization only through the description of its destruction, only as something that once was and is no more, and this awareness of loss suffuses every detail with melancholy significance. The golden statues of the kings, the ivory roofs adorned with precious metals, the colossal image of Poseidon in his chariot. All these wonders exist now only in imagination, preserved solely in the words of a philosopher who may himself have imagined them. They cannot be visited or photographed or touched. They have no location on any map. And yet they seem somehow more vivid, more powerfully present to the mind than many things that do exist, because they inhabit that special realm of human consciousness where beauty and loss combine to produce the peculiar intensity that we call nostalgia, or longing, or the sense of the sublime. This aesthetic dimension has made the Atlantis story particularly attractive to romantic and visionary artists, to those who find in the contemplation of ruins and lost worlds a source of profound emotion and creative inspiration. The underwater city, silent and still, its streets empty of the bustle that once filled them, its temples unvisited by worshippers, its harbours receiving no ships, its whole magnificent fabric slowly crumbling under the weight of the ocean above, has become one of the great images of Western art, an image that speaks to our awareness of mortality and transience, to our sense that all human achievements are temporary, that time devours everything, that even the greatest civilizations are building, without knowing it, the ruins that future generations will contemplate with wonder and sadness. And so the legend of Atlantis continues to live in the cultural imagination, undiminished by the accumulation of evidence against its historical reality, sustained by the power of its images and the depth of its meanings. It lives in the novels and films and video games that reimagine it for new audiences, in the scholarly debates about its origins and significance, in the popular fascination with lost civilizations and ancient mysteries. It lives in the dreams of those who, falling asleep to the soft murmur of the waves, imagine a city beneath the surface, preserved forever in the green twilight of the deep, waiting to be discovered, waiting to reveal its secrets to those patient enough to seek them. And perhaps most importantly, it lives in the questions it continues to raise about who we are and where we are going, about the choices we make as individuals and as societies, about the relationship between our powers and our purposes, between what we can do and what we should do, between the material achievements that dazzle the eye and the moral qualities that alone can give those achievements meaning and value. The night grows deeper now, and the ancient story settles around us like a familiar blanket, its contours known but its depth still unexplored. Somewhere out beyond the margins of the map, beyond the pillars of Heracles, beyond the edge of the world that the ancients knew, the lost island keeps its vigil beneath the patient waves, its memory preserved in the accumulating layers of human culture, in the endless retelling of a tale that may be fiction, or may be something more. The philosophers debate, and the archaeologists search, and the dreamers dream, and meanwhile the legend itself abides, unchanged and unchanging, as fresh and as mysterious as it was on the day that Plato first set pen to papyrus, and began to write of the island empire that had risen and fallen in the dawn of time, long before the memory of the oldest civilization, long before the first stone was laid upon the pyramids, long before anything that we can verify or document, in an age as remote from Plato's Athens as Plato's Athens is remote from us. The story asks nothing of us but that we listen, that we let its images form in our minds, that we allow ourselves to wonder for a little while about worlds that have been lost and worlds that might yet be, about the past that we can never recover and the future that we cannot see. And in the wondering, perhaps, we come closer to understanding something essential about ourselves, about the creatures we are, who build and dream and remember and forget, who raise great cities only to watch them fall, who tell stories across the generations because we know, in some deep part of ourselves, that we too will one day be stories, told by those who come after, remembered or forgotten as fate decrees, our own civilizations destined to become the Atlantises of future ages, preserved only in legend, recalled only in dreams, sleeping at last beneath the slow and endless turning of the world. The question of what Atlantis means, and why it has meant so much to so many people across such an expanse of time, leads us inevitably to consider the nature of myth itself, and the peculiar place that stories of lost civilizations hold in the human imagination. For Atlantis is not merely a single legend, but a representative of an entire category of human storytelling, a species of narrative that appears in cultures around the world, the tale of the golden age that has passed away, the paradise that has been lost, the great achievement that has been swallowed by time or water or the wrath of the gods. Understanding why these stories persist, why they speak to generation after generation with undiminished power, requires us to look beyond the particular details of Plato's account and to consider the deeper structures of human thought and feeling that such narratives address. The mythologist Joseph Campbell, in his influential studies of comparative mythology, observed that certain patterns of storytelling appear again and again across the cultures of the world, patterns so fundamental and so widespread that they seem to emerge from some common source in human psychology itself, from the basic structures of the mind that all human beings share regardless of when or where they live. Campbell called these recurring patterns archetypes, borrowing a term from the psychologist Carl Jung, and he argued that myths and legends, far from being mere entertainment or primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena, serve essential functions in human life, giving shape and meaning to experiences that would otherwise remain formless and overwhelming. The story of the fall from a golden age, the loss of paradise, the destruction of a perfect world, is among the most powerful and the most universal of these archetypal narratives, appearing in one form or another in the mythologies of nearly every culture that has left a record of its beliefs. In the Hebrew scriptures, we find the story of the Garden of Eden, the perfect world from which humanity was expelled through its own disobedience. In Hindu mythology, we encounter the concept of the Satya Yuga, the age of truth and righteousness that existed at the beginning of time and has gradually declined through successive ages into the corruption and confusion of the present Kali Yuga. In Greek mythology, beyond the specific tale of Atlantis, we find the story of the 5 ages of humanity told by the poet Hesiod, beginning with a golden race that lived in perfect happiness under the rule of Cronus, and declining through silver and bronze and heroic ages to the iron age of toil and suffering in which Hesiod believed himself to live. In Norse mythology, we encounter the memory of an age before the corruption of the world, an age that will return only after the destruction of the present order in the cosmic battle of Ragnarok. And in countless other traditions, from the Americas to Asia to Africa to the Pacific Islands, we find variations on this same fundamental theme, the memory or the imagination of a better world that once existed and has been lost. The persistence of this pattern across such diverse cultures and such vast stretches of time suggests that the story of the lost golden age addresses something fundamental in human experience, something that transcends the particular circumstances of any one civilization or any one historical moment. Psychologists and anthropologists have proposed various explanations for this phenomenon. Some have suggested that the myth of the Golden Age reflects a collective memory of childhood, of the time in each individual's life when the world seemed simpler and more secure, when the burdens of adult responsibility had not yet descended, when parents or other caregivers provided for all one's needs and shielded one from the full weight of reality. In this reading, the lost paradise is a projection outward onto cosmic time of the individual's longing for the security and innocence of early life, a nostalgia for a state that each person has genuinely experienced and genuinely lost in the process of growing up. Others have proposed that the myth reflects a more social or historical phenomenon, the tendency of each generation to idolize the past and to view the present as a time of decline, a tendency that may be particularly strong in periods of genuine upheaval or crisis, but that seems to be present in some degree in nearly all human societies. The elders of every age have complained that the young no longer respect tradition, that standards have fallen, that the world has grown worse than it was in their youth, and this perennial complaint, when projected backward across many generations, produces naturally the image of a remote and perfect past from which all subsequent history represents a decline. Still others have argued that the myth of the Golden Age serves a more specifically political or ideological function, providing a model and a justification for social reform by positing an original state of justice and equality from which present inequalities represent a falling away, or alternatively serving to legitimate existing hierarchies by suggesting that the present order, however imperfect, preserves what can be preserved of an ancient and divinely ordained arrangement. Whatever the explanation, the pattern is clear, and the story of Atlantis fits squarely within it. Plato's lost island empire is a golden age narrative in the fullest sense, a tale of an original perfection that gradually declined through moral corruption until it was finally destroyed by the judgment of the gods. The Atlanteans begin with divine blood in their veins, dwelling in a paradise of natural abundance and civilized beauty, and for many generations they maintain their virtue, despising wealth for its own sake and valuing only goodness and wisdom. But over time, as the divine element within them is diluted by mortal nature, they fall prey to the same vices that afflict all merely human societies: the lust for power, the greed for possessions, the pride that overreaches and brings destruction upon itself. And so they perish, swallowed by the earth and the sea, punished for their sins by the king of the gods, their magnificent civilization reduced in a single day and night to a shoal of impassable mud beneath the waves. It is a story that echoes through all the subsequent centuries of Western civilization, reinforced by the parallel story of the biblical flood, in which an entire world is destroyed for its wickedness, and only a single righteous family preserved to begin anew, and by the countless other tales of divine judgment visited upon the proud and the wicked, from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah to the fall of Babel, to the many cautionary tales of Greek mythology in which mortals who defy the gods are struck down for their hubris. The message of all these stories is the same: a warning against the pride that forgets its own limitations, against the ambition that reaches beyond what is permitted, against the corruption that comes from pursuing wealth and power at the expense of virtue and wisdom. And whether or not Plato intended his story of Atlantis to be taken as literal history, he clearly intended it to convey this moral lesson, to serve as a mirror in which his own society and all subsequent societies might see reflected the dangers of their own prosperity and power. The reception of the Atlantis legend across the centuries reveals much about the changing preoccupations and assumptions of Western civilization. In the ancient world after Plato, the story attracted relatively little attention, and most of those who did discuss it seem to have understood it as a philosophical myth rather than a historical report. Plato's own student Aristotle is reported to have dismissed the story with the comment that the same man who created Atlantis also destroyed it, implying that the whole tale was Plato's invention rather than a genuine tradition received from Egypt. Other ancient philosophers, particularly those of the Neoplatonic school in the later centuries of antiquity, treated the story as an allegory, reading the conflict between Atlantis and Athens as a representation of cosmic principles, of the struggle between different aspects of the soul or different levels of reality. For these later Platonists, the literal question of whether there had ever been an island called Atlantis was far less important than the spiritual and philosophical truths that the story was thought to encode, and they devoted their energies to interpreting those truths rather than to locating the physical remains of the lost civilization. The medieval period in European history saw relatively little interest in Atlantis, in part because the dialogues in which Plato told the story were not widely known in the Latin West during the early Middle Ages, and in part because medieval Christians had their own comprehensive account of ancient history derived from the Hebrew Scriptures, an account that left little room for lost civilizations predating the biblical flood. The story of Noah and the deluge that destroyed all life save for those preserved in the ark seem to explain whatever traditions might exist of a catastrophe in the ancient past, and there was no need to look further for explanations. When interest in Atlantis did revive, it was in the context of the great expansion of European geographical knowledge that began in the late 15th century, when the voyages of exploration that brought European ships to the Americas opened up new possibilities for locating the lost island. The discovery of the Americas was one of the most transformative events in European intellectual history, shattering the ancient and medieval picture of the world and raising a host of questions that the traditional authorities could not answer. Here were vast continents of which the Bible, the Greek and Roman geographers, and all the accumulated wisdom of the ages had said nothing, populated by peoples whose origin and nature were entirely unknown. How could these lands and these peoples be fitted into the existing framework of knowledge? Where had these indigenous Americans come from? How had they reached their distant lands? Were they descendants of Adam and Eve like all other human beings? And if so, through what line of descent? These questions provoked intense debate throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, and in the midst of that debate, the ancient story of Atlantis found a new relevance and a new life. Some writers proposed that Atlantis was America, that the land described by Plato as lying beyond the Pillars of Heracles was none other than the great western continent that Columbus and his successors had revealed to European eyes. In this reading, the Atlanteans had not perished at all, or at least not entirely, and their descendants still lived in the New World, the indigenous peoples whose civilizations had so astonished the Spanish conquistadors. The great cities of the Aztecs and the Incas, with their monumental architecture and their sophisticated social organization, seemed to some observers to preserve echoes of the lost magnificence that Plato had described, and the native traditions of these peoples, with their stories of ancient catastrophes and vanished cities, seemed to confirm that a memory of Atlantis persisted in the Americas. The Spanish chronicler Francisco López de Gómara proposed in the 16th century that Atlantis and America were the same, and this identification was taken up by numerous subsequent writers who elaborated upon it in various ways, some arguing that the indigenous Americans were the direct descendants of Atlantean survivors, others suggesting that they had descended from other Old World peoples who had reached the Americas before Columbus, by way of Atlantis before it sank. Other writers in this period used the legend of Atlantis in different ways, not to explain the origin of the Americas, but to imagine ideal societies, or to critique the deficiencies of their own. The English philosopher Francis Bacon, one of the founders of modern scientific method, wrote an unfinished utopian work called The New Atlantis, published in 1627, in which he described an imaginary island in the Pacific Ocean, governed by a society of learned men who had organised themselves around the systematic pursuit of knowledge for the betterment of humanity. Bacon's Atlantis was not Plato's lost island, but a new one, a vision of what a society dedicated to science and to the improvement of human life might look like, and his use of the name signalled his intention to offer an alternative to the ancient story, a tale not of decline and destruction, but of progress and hope. The New Atlantis was profoundly influential in the subsequent development of scientific institutions, and some historians have argued that it helped to inspire the founding of the Royal Society of London, one of the first modern scientific academies, which was established a few decades after Bacon's death, with purposes that echoed those of his imaginary College of the 6 Days' Works. In this way, the legend of Atlantis, which had begun as a cautionary tale about the dangers of human pride and the impermanence of human achievement, was transformed into an inspiration for human progress, a model not of what had been lost but of what might yet be built. The modern fascination with Atlantis as a potentially real and recoverable lost civilization owes much to a single book published in the late 19th century, a work that did more than any other to fix the image of Atlantis in the popular imagination and to inspire the countless searches and speculations that have followed. This was Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, published in 1882 by Ignatius Donnelly, an American politician and amateur scholar whose wide-ranging interests and vivid prose style made him one of the most popular writers of his generation. Donnelly approached the legend of Atlantis not as a philosopher or a literary scholar, but as what we might today call a pseudo-scientific investigator, and he treated Plato's account as a substantially accurate record of historical fact, deserving of the same respect and the same methods of inquiry that would be applied to any other ancient source. His book was an attempt to prove the existence of Atlantis through a marshalling of evidence drawn from geology, archaeology, linguistics, mythology, and every other field that might bear upon the question, and though his arguments have not withstood the test of time, his influence on popular culture has been immense and enduring. Donnelly's theory was comprehensive and ambitious. He proposed that Atlantis had been a real island located in the Atlantic Ocean, roughly where Plato had said it was, and that it had been the home of the first great civilization in human history, the source from which all subsequent civilizations had derived their arts, their sciences, their religions, and their governments. The similarities that had been observed between the cultures of the Old World and the New, between the pyramids of Egypt and the pyramids of Mexico, between the mythologies of Europe and the mythologies of the Americas, were not coincidences but evidence of a common origin, a single ancestral culture that had influenced both hemispheres before its destruction. The gods and heroes of ancient mythology, Donnelly argued, were actually the kings and queens of Atlantis, remembered dimly by their distant descendants, and gradually elevated to divine status through the distortions of time and tradition. The legends of a great flood found in so many cultures around the world were memories of the actual destruction of Atlantis, an event so catastrophic that it had left its mark on the collective memory of humanity. And the task of the modern scholar, Donnelly believed, was to sift through this accumulated debris of legend and tradition, to separate the truth from the embellishment, and to recover the actual history that lay buried beneath layers of mythological elaboration. Donnelly's book was enormously successful, going through numerous editions and translations and remaining in print for decades, and its influence can be traced in virtually every subsequent popular treatment of the Atlantis legend. the basic template that Donnelly established, the idea of Atlantis as the mother civilization of humanity, the source of all ancient wisdom and achievement, destroyed by a natural catastrophe, but surviving in fragmentary form in the myths and monuments of later cultures, has been endlessly repeated and elaborated by subsequent writers, becoming the standard framework within which popular discussions of Atlantis have taken place ever since. And though professional scientists and historians have consistently rejected Donnelly's specific claims, his broader vision of a lost advanced civilization has proven remarkably resilient in popular culture, adapting itself to new discoveries and new speculations while retaining its essential form. The 20th century saw an explosion of interest in Atlantis and in lost civilizations more generally, an interest that reflected both the growing accessibility of archaeological discoveries and the persistence of certain romantic assumptions about the past. The development of underwater archaeology, the decipherment of ancient scripts, the discovery of previously unknown civilizations like the Minoans and the Indus Valley culture, all seem to suggest that the past was richer and more complex than had been imagined, that great achievements had been made by peoples who had been forgotten, that the conventional picture of human history as a steady progression from primitive origins to modern sophistication might need to be revised. And in this context, the idea that there might be even more to discover, that there might be civilizations still more ancient and still more accomplished than those already known, seemed not only possible, but likely. The story of Atlantis offered a framework for these speculations, a placeholder for whatever unknown wonders might yet be revealed, and writers of all kinds rushed to fill that placeholder with their own visions and theories. Some proposed that Atlantis had been destroyed by a natural catastrophe of a type that modern science could now explain, a volcanic eruption like the one that had devastated Thera, or an asteroid impact of the sort that had killed the dinosaurs, or a sudden shift in the Earth's crust that had relocated the entire island to a new position, perhaps beneath the ice of Antarctica. Others suggested that Atlantis had been home to technologies far in advance of anything the ancient world was supposed to have possessed, that the Atlanteans had known the secrets of flight or of atomic power, that their destruction had been the result of their own technological hubris rather than divine judgment. Still others went further still, proposing that the Atlanteans had been visitors from other worlds, extraterrestrial beings who had brought advanced knowledge to primitive humanity, and whose descendants had founded all the great civilizations of the ancient world before returning to the stars or perishing in some cosmic catastrophe. These increasingly speculative theories found eager audiences in the popular culture of the 20th century, filling the shelves of bookstores with titles that promised to reveal the truth about Atlantis, and inspiring films and television programs, and eventually video games that made the Lost Island a familiar presence in the landscape of modern entertainment. The scholarly response to this popular fascination has generally been one of patient skepticism. Professional archaeologists and historians, while acknowledging the cultural significance of the Atlantis legend, have consistently maintained that there is no credible evidence for the existence of a lost continent or advanced prehistoric civilization of the type that Donnelly and his successors have imagined. The geology of the Atlantic Ocean floor has been extensively mapped, and no trace of a sunken continent has been found. The archaeology of the ancient Mediterranean has been thoroughly investigated, and while it has revealed civilizations of great sophistication and achievement, it has not uncovered anything that suggests the existence of an empire corresponding to Plato's description. The linguistics of ancient languages has been carefully studied, and while the relationships between language families are complex and sometimes surprising, they do not point to a single ancestral culture in the Atlantic from which all others derived. And the comparative study of mythology, while illuminating the common patterns that appear in the stories told by different peoples, has not supported the hypothesis that these commonalities reflect the diffusion of ideas from a single lost civilization rather than the independent emergence of similar themes from the shared structures of human psychology. The theory that has gained the most scholarly attention as a possible source for Plato's legend is the identification of Atlantis with the Minoan civilization of Bronze Age Crete and the catastrophic eruption of the volcanic island of Thera, also known as Santorini, which occurred around 1600 BCE. The Minoans were the first advanced civilization of the Aegean world, builders of elaborate palaces and creators of sophisticated art, seafarers who dominated the eastern Mediterranean in the centuries before the rise of Mycenaean Greece. Their civilization came to an abrupt and mysterious end around the time of the Theran eruption, one of the largest volcanic events in recorded history, which buried the Minoan settlement on Thera itself under deep layers of ash and sent massive tsunamis crashing into the coasts of Crete and the surrounding islands. The parallels between this actual catastrophe and Plato's story of Atlantis are suggestive, an island civilization of great wealth and sophistication, destroyed suddenly by a natural disaster, sinking in some sense beneath the sea. Some scholars have proposed that a distant memory of the Minoan collapse, transmitted through Egyptian records or oral tradition, might have reached Plato and been transformed by him into the legend he recounted, with the details altered and the timescale vastly inflated to serve his philosophical purposes. This theory remains controversial, and there are significant objections to it. Plato's Atlantis is located in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, not in the Aegean, and his description of the island's size and geography does not match what we know of either Crete or Thera. The timescale Plato gives, 9,000 years before Solon, places Atlantis far earlier than the Minoan period, and while Plato may have exaggerated or misunderstood his source, the discrepancy is difficult to explain entirely away. Moreover, the Minoans, despite their cultural sophistication, were not the aggressive military empire that Plato describes, and the political details of his account do not correspond well to what archaeology has revealed about their society. Still, the Minoan hypothesis represents perhaps the most serious scholarly attempt to identify a historical kernel within Plato's legend, and it continues to be debated and refined by researchers interested in the relationship between ancient myth and historical reality. The question of whether Atlantis was real in the end may be less important than the question of why it matters, why this particular story among all the stories that have been told about the past has captured and held the human imagination with such tenacity. The answer may lie not in the details of Plato's account, however vivid and compelling those details may be, but in the deeper needs and longings that the story addresses, needs that are as present today as they were in the 4th century BCE, and that will likely remain present as long as human beings continue to tell stories about themselves and their world. We need to believe that the past was grander than the present, that there were ages of gold before the ages of iron in which we live, that the world has fallen from a height to which it might one day return. We need to believe that the achievements of the past, however mighty, were not permanent, that even the greatest civilizations are vulnerable, that nothing built by human hands can last forever, and that this impermanence is not merely a cause for sorrow, but also a warning against the pride that forgets its own mortality. We need to contemplate the mystery of what has been lost, the things that we can never recover, the people and places and ways of life that have vanished beyond any possibility of reconstruction, because in that contemplation we come to terms with our own eventual vanishing, with the certainty that we too will one day be forgotten, that the world will go on without us, that everything we love and everything we have built will sooner or later pass into the silence from which it came. The legend of Atlantis speaks to all of these needs, and in doing so it has earned its place among the great stories of humanity, the stories that we tell and retell not because they inform us about facts, but because they form us as human beings, shaping our understanding of who we are and what our lives mean. Whether or not there was ever an island in the Western Ocean, whether or not there were kings who ruled there and temples that gleamed with gold and orichalcum, whether or not the sea swallowed a civilization in a single day and night, the story itself is real as any story can be, alive in the minds of those who hear it and carry it forward to the next generation. And in the quiet hours of the night, when the world has grown still and the only sound is the gentle murmur of distant waters, the imagination can travel far from the waking world, can cross the vast and empty ocean, can descend through the green depths to a place where time has stopped and nothing changes, where the walls still gleam and the temples still stand and the long-dead kings keep their eternal vigil, waiting in the darkness for the dawn that will never come, sleeping the sleep of the ages beneath the slow and endless rocking of the waves above. The story of Atlantis, having passed through all the transformations and interpretations that more than 2 millennia could bring to it, having been sought in every ocean and on every continent, having been claimed by dreamers and charlatans and sincere seekers after truth, having been debated by philosophers and geologists and archaeologists and mystics, arrives at last in our own time, carrying all the weight and all the wonder that 24 centuries have layered upon it. And it is here, in the present moment, that we may finally ask what Atlantis means to us now, what purpose this ancient tale serves in an age that has mapped every corner of the earth, that has sent submersibles to the deepest trenches of the ocean floor, that has photographed the surface of distant planets and decoded the ancient languages of forgotten peoples. In an age that has demystified so much of the world that once seemed magical and unknowable, what place remains for a legend about a lost island that almost certainly never existed in the form that Plato described it, and that in all probability was never meant to be taken as literal geographical fact in the first place? The answer to this question may lie in understanding what legends are for, what function they serve in the mental and spiritual economy of human beings. A legend is not the same thing as a lie, even when it describes events that never happened and places that never existed. A legend is a particular kind of truth, a truth that operates not at the level of fact, but at the level of meaning, addressing not what happened, but what matters, not the surface of events, but the depths beneath them. The great legends of humanity, the stories that have endured across centuries and millennia, while countless true accounts of actual events have been forgotten, endure precisely because they speak to something permanent in the human condition, something that does not change even as civilizations rise and fall. Technologies transform the conditions of life, and the map of the known world expands to encompass territories that previous generations could not have imagined. Atlantis endures because it addresses questions that every generation must confront anew, questions about the nature of greatness and the causes of decline, about the relationship between material prosperity and moral character, about the impermanence of all human achievement, and the mystery of historical forgetting. Consider what Plato was grappling with when he wrote his dialogues about Atlantis in the 4th century before the Common Era. He was a man who had witnessed the decline and defeat of his own city, Athens, which had been the leading power of the Greek world during his childhood, and which had been humbled and devastated by its long war with Sparta. He had seen the democracy that his city prized bring forth demagogues and warmongers, had watched the execution of his beloved teacher Socrates by a democratic jury that convicted him of corrupting the youth and dishonouring the gods. He had travelled widely in the Mediterranean world, had seen the remnants of civilizations far older than Greece, had conversed with learned men from many lands about the nature of good government and the causes of political decay. And he had devoted his life to the question of how human beings might organise their societies so as to live well, so as to flourish both materially and spiritually, so as to avoid the corruption that seemed inevitably to follow upon prosperity and power. The legend of Atlantis, whether Plato found it in Egyptian records or created it from his own philosophical imagination, gave him a way to address these questions in a form that would engage the emotions as well as the intellect, that would speak not merely to the reasoning faculty, but to the whole human being who seeks to understand the meaning of history and the destiny of nations. The structure of the legend itself reveals its moral purpose with remarkable clarity. Atlantis begins as a gift from the gods, a blessed land endowed with every natural advantage, ruled by kings who carry divine blood in their veins, and who possess the wisdom and virtue that such an inheritance implies. For many generations, the Atlanteans used their gifts well, maintaining the balance between material wealth and spiritual integrity that Plato considered essential to the good life. They possess gold and silver and orichalcum in abundance, but they do not worship these metals or make them the measure of all things. They have the power to conquer and dominate their neighbours, but they restrain themselves within the bounds of justice. They enjoy the pleasures that their wealth can provide, but they do not become enslaved to those pleasures, or forget that true happiness lies in virtue rather than in possession. This is the golden age of Atlantis, the period of its genuine greatness, when the descendants of Poseidon honoured their divine heritage by living according to the higher standards of which human beings are capable. And then the decline begins, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, as the divine element within the Atlantean bloodline becomes diluted through successive generations of mixture with ordinary mortal nature. The change is described by Plato in terms that are almost biological, as if moral corruption were a kind of genetic degradation, a weakening of the original divine seed through too much admixture with baser material. The Atlanteans do not suddenly become wicked, do not consciously choose to abandon the ways of their ancestors. Rather, they gradually lose the capacity to see clearly. to recognize the difference between genuine goods and mere appearances of goods, to understand that the external trappings of prosperity are worthless if they are not accompanied by the internal qualities of character that give them meaning. They begin to value their gold and their power for their own sake, to measure their happiness by the standard of how much they possess, rather than by the standard of how virtuously they live. They become, in Plato's memorable phrase, unable to bear their prosperity, corrupted by the very gifts that had been meant to bless them. This pattern of rise and decline, of golden ages giving way to corruption and eventual catastrophe, is one of the oldest and most universal themes in human storytelling, appearing in the myths and legends of civilizations around the world. The Hindu concept of the yugas, the ages through which the world passes in a great cycle, from perfection to degradation and back again, tells a similar story at the cosmic scale. The biblical narrative of the Garden of Eden and the fall describes humanity's loss of original innocence and blessing through disobedience and the pursuit of forbidden knowledge. The Greek myth of the ages of man, recounted by the poet Hesiod, traces a decline from a golden age through silver and bronze to the iron age of toil and suffering in which the poet believed himself to live. The Roman poet Ovid would later elaborate this theme in his Metamorphoses, describing how the early ages of peace and plenty gave way to ages of war and wickedness as humanity moved ever further from its original state of grace. All of these stories reflect a deep intuition about the nature of human existence, a sense that the world was once better than it is now, that we have lost something precious that our ancestors possessed, and that our present condition represents a falling away from a higher state that we dimly remember or imagine. The legend of Atlantis participates in this universal pattern, but gives it a distinctive twist by making the decline not merely a general cosmic process, but a specific moral failure that can be understood and potentially avoided. The Atlanteans do not fall because fate decrees it, or because the gods capriciously withdraw their favour. They fall because they make choices, because they gradually allow their values to shift from the things that truly matter to the things that merely seem to matter, because they forget the wisdom of their ancestors and embrace instead the glittering illusions of wealth and power. This is not merely a story about the past, but a warning for the present and the future, a cautionary tale addressed to every individual and every society that has been blessed with prosperity and that faces the challenge of maintaining its integrity in the face of temptation. The question that Atlantis poses is not whether it really existed, but whether we are capable of learning from its example, whether we can recognize in ourselves the same tendencies toward corruption that destroyed the island empire and can take steps to counteract them before it is too late. This moral dimension of the legend helps explain why Atlantis has resonated so powerfully with so many different kinds of people across so many different historical periods. The occultists and mystics who have embraced the legend as literal truth are responding to something real in the story, even if they are mistaken about its factual basis. They sense that Atlantis represents a possibility that has been lost, a potential that humanity once possessed and might somehow recover, a state of being that is higher and more complete than the fragmented and degraded existence that most human beings experience. The scientists and rationalists who dismissed the legend as mere fiction are also responding to something real, recognizing that the story cannot be verified by the methods of empirical investigation, and that credulity about such matters can lead to confusion and superstition. Both responses are understandable, but neither fully captures the significance of the legend, which operates at a level that is neither purely factual nor purely fictional, but rather mythic, addressing the deepest questions about human nature and human destiny through the medium of symbolic narrative. The persistence of the Atlantis legend in the modern world, despite the overwhelming scholarly consensus that it represents a Platonic invention rather than a historical memory, testifies to the power of myth to survive the challenges of skeptical investigation. Every few years, it seems, a new theory emerges claiming to have finally identified the real location of Atlantis, to have found the archaeological evidence that proves the legend true, to have decoded the hidden message in Plato's text that reveals the precise coordinates of the sunken city. These theories are announced with great fanfare, attract the attention of the press and the public, generate books and documentaries and television specials, and then gradually fade from view as their specific claims are examined and found wanting by the standards of rigorous scholarship. And yet the legend itself remains undiminished, as compelling and as mysterious as ever. waiting for the next generation of seekers to take up the quest and to propose their own solutions to the ancient riddle. This pattern of repeated discovery and debunking, of enthusiasm followed by disappointment followed by renewed enthusiasm, suggests that the search for Atlantis is not really about finding a physical location at all. It is about something else, something that cannot be satisfied by the discovery of any particular set of ruins or the decipherment of any particular ancient text. What the searchers are looking for, whether they know it or not, is not a place but a meaning, not a destination but a journey, not an answer but a question that keeps them engaged with the mystery of the past and the possibility of hidden wonders that the conventional wisdom has overlooked. The search for Atlantis is in this sense a kind of spiritual exercise, a way of keeping alive the sense of wonder and possibility that can easily be lost in a world that seems to have been fully mapped and catalogued and explained. It is a protest against the closure of the known, an insistence that there is always more to discover, always deeper levels to explore, always mysteries that have not yet yielded up their secrets. The image of Atlantis sinking beneath the waves which forms the climax of Plato's legend is perhaps the most powerful and evocative element of the whole story, the image that has lodged most firmly in the human imagination and that continues to haunt us across the centuries. There is something peculiarly moving about the idea of a whole civilization vanishing beneath the sea, disappearing not gradually through decline and conquest and assimilation, but suddenly and totally, swallowed up by the waters in a single catastrophic moment. The sea, in this image, becomes not merely a geographical feature, but a symbol of oblivion itself, the great eraser that wipes away the works of humanity and returns them to the primal chaos from which they emerged. What lies beneath the waves is hidden, inaccessible, beyond the reach of ordinary investigation, and this hiddenness is itself a kind of preservation, protecting the lost world from the further degradation that would come from exposure to the air and the light. The drowned city sleeps in the depths, unchanged and unchanging, frozen at the moment of its destruction, never aging, never decaying, maintaining forever the beauty and the grandeur that it possessed at the height of its power. This image speaks to the universal human experience of loss and memory, to the way that the past seems to recede from us even as we try to hold on to it, sinking ever deeper into the dark waters of forgetting until only fragments and echoes remain. We all carry within us our own drowned Atlantises, the lost worlds of childhood and youth and earlier periods of life that can never be recovered, that exist now only in the imperfect medium of memory, and that grow more distant and more mysterious with each passing year. The legend of Atlantis gives external form to this internal experience, projecting onto the map of the world the sense of irretrievable loss that is an inevitable part of the human condition. When we imagine the great island sinking beneath the waves, we are imagining our own past, our own losses, the things that we have loved and that have passed away beyond any possibility of return. And yet the legend also offers a kind of consolation, a hint that what has been lost is not simply gone but preserved in another form, sleeping beneath the surface of consciousness, waiting perhaps to be awakened or at least to be remembered. The sea in Plato's account does not destroy Atlantis so much as hide it, removing it from the world of the living but not annihilating it altogether. The city remains intact beneath the waves, its temples still standing, its walls still gleaming, its statues still keeping their eternal vigil over the empty streets and the silent harbours. This is not the consolation of literal resurrection, the promise that the lost world will one day rise again from the depths and be restored to its former glory. It is rather the consolation of memory and imagination, the assurance that what has passed away can still be visited in the mind, can still be contemplated and honoured and learned from, can still speak to us across the gulf of time if we have the patience and the receptivity to listen. The legend of Atlantis, in the end, is not about Atlantis at all, but about us, about human beings and our relationship to time and memory and meaning. It is a mirror that Plato held up to his own civilization, and that we continue to hold up to ours, seeing in the rise and fall of the island empire a reflection of our own hopes and fears about the trajectory of human history. Are we, like the Atlanteans, building a magnificent civilization that will one day be swallowed by the sea? Are we like them, gradually losing the divine element within us, becoming unable to bear our prosperity, forgetting the wisdom of our ancestors in our pursuit of power and wealth? Or is there still time to learn from their example, to change course before the catastrophe becomes inevitable? to recover the virtues that made the early Atlanteans worthy of their divine inheritance? These questions cannot be answered by archaeological investigation or geological survey. They can only be answered by the choices that we make, individually and collectively, about how we wish to live and what kind of civilization we wish to build. The legend of Atlantis does not tell us what those choices should be, does not prescribe a specific program of political or social reform that will save us from the fate of the island empire. It merely reminds us that the choices matter, that civilizations are not eternal, that prosperity and power are not sufficient guarantees of survival, and that the moral character of a people is ultimately more important than the material resources at their disposal. This is a message that needs to be repeated in every generation, because every generation faces the same temptations and the same dangers, and because the memory of previous failures is never enough by itself to prevent new ones. And so the legend endures, passed down from generation to generation like a precious heirloom, each age finding in it new meanings and new applications while preserving the essential core that makes it recognizable across time. The Atlantis of Plato, the Atlantis of the Renaissance visionaries, the Atlantis of the 19th century occultists, the Atlantis of the modern popular imagination are all different in their details and their emphasis, shaped by the concerns and the assumptions of the periods that produced them. But they are all recognizably the same story, the story of a great civilization that rose and flourished and fell, that was swallowed by the sea and that sleeps still in the depths, waiting to be remembered and contemplated and learned from. This continuity across time is itself a kind of triumph over oblivion, a demonstration that some things can survive the flood of forgetting that sweeps away most of what human beings think and do and create. The night has grown late now, and the story has been told as fully as it can be told, from the moment when an old philosopher in Athens first set down the tale to the present hour when we consider its meaning for our own lives and our own civilization. The great island lies quiet beneath the waves of imagination, its towers and temples and harbours preserved forever in the amber of legend, beyond the reach of time and decay. The priests of Sais, who first told the story to Solon, are dust, and Solon himself is dust, and Plato, who wrote down the tale, is dust, and all the countless generations who have wondered about Atlantis and searched for it and debated its reality are dust. But the story itself remains, as vivid and as mysterious as it was on the first day it was told, a gift from the past to the present, and from the present to the future. Let the imagination descend now one final time through the green depths of the western sea, sinking slowly through the layers of water that have accumulated above the lost city over all the long millennia since its destruction. The light fades as the descent continues, the bright surface world giving way to dimmer and dimmer shades of blue and green, until at last there is only darkness, the absolute darkness of the deep ocean floor where no ray of sunlight has ever penetrated. And there, in that darkness, the great walls still stand, the great temples still rise, the great statues of the ancient kings still gaze out over the empty thoroughfares with eyes that have seen nothing for 11,000 years. The fish that swim through the drowned streets are the descendants of fish that swam through these same streets when the catastrophe was fresh, generation following generation in an unbroken chain of oceanic life, knowing nothing of the human drama that played out here so long ago. The corals and the sponges have grown up over the works of human hands, softening the outlines of the architecture, blurring the distinctions between what was natural and what was made. The orichalcum, if it ever existed, has long since been transformed by the chemistry of the sea into something unrecognizable, its red fire quenched, its glory hidden beneath layers of sediment and biological growth. But in the imagination, in the story, the city remains as it was, gleaming and magnificent, a monument to human aspiration and human folly, to the heights that we can achieve and the depths to which we can fall. The legend of Atlantis is not a map to a physical location, but a map to a state of mind, a reminder that the past is always present with us, that every civilization carries within it the seeds of its own destruction, and that the choices we make today will determine whether our own works endure or sink beneath the waves of time. This is the message that Plato encoded in his tale, the message that has resonated across 24 centuries, and that continues to speak to us in the quiet hours of the night when the distractions of the day have faded, and we are left alone with our thoughts and our questions about what it all means. The waves continue their eternal rhythm above the place where the island once stood, rising and falling in patterns that have not changed since the world was young, that will not change until the world grows old and the seas themselves are no more. The moon rises and sets, the stars wheel through their courses, the seasons follow one another in their appointed order, and far below, in the darkness and the silence, the lost city keeps its vigil, patient and enduring, asking nothing, demanding nothing, simply waiting for those who will remember it and learn from it and carry its story forward to the generations yet to come. And so we leave Atlantis at last, rising slowly from the depths where we have lingered, ascending through the layers of water toward the surface and the light, carrying with us the memory of what we have seen and heard and contemplated. The great island grows smaller beneath us as we rise, dwindling from a continent to an island to a speck to nothing at all, lost once more in the immensity of the ocean that has been its grave and its guardian for all these thousands of years. The surface breaks above us, and we emerge into the air and the light of the ordinary world, the world of waking and doing and striving and forgetting. But something has changed. We carry within us now a piece of the story, a fragment of the legend that has been passed down through all the generations since Plato first told it, and that we will pass down in our turn to those who come after us. This is the immortality that legends possess, an immortality not of stone or bronze but of human memory and human telling, fragile and yet strangely durable, capable of surviving catastrophes that would destroy any physical monument. The walls of the real Atlantis, if there ever was a real Atlantis, have crumbled long ago into unrecognizable ruins. But the walls of the imagined Atlantis still stand, perfect and eternal, gleaming in the light of the inner eye, and will stand as long as human beings continue to tell stories about the wonders of the past and the lessons that those wonders have to teach. The lost city of Atlantis had represented, across all the centuries of its retelling, something that transcended the boundaries of any single civilization or any single historical moment, embodying the universal human dream of golden ages and the universal human fear of their inevitable end, preserving in the amber of legend a meditation on greatness and corruption that spoke as clearly to the 21st century as it had spoken to the 4th century before the Common Era, creating both a warning against the pride that destroys and a consolation for the loss that time inevitably brings, sleeping still beneath the slow and endless rocking of the waves in that peaceful darkness where the story began and where, perhaps, it will rest forever. Rest.